He pulled the ring off her finger in front of everyone. Not privately, not with the decency of a closed door or a whispered conversation in some back hallway. Lucian Draven did it in the middle of the Black Accord banquet, 300 of the most dangerous people in America watching. And he did it slowly, deliberately, like a man who wanted every single person in that ballroom to understand exactly what he was saying. Seraphine felt the gold band slide off her finger before she fully understood what was happening. Then she heard the laughter. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt the floor disappear beneath you, if you've ever smiled when every instinct in your body was screaming, then you already know what the next 10 seconds of Seraphine Ashcroft's life felt like. Stay with me to the end of this story. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Black Accord banquet happened every year on the last Friday of October, and every year it meant the same thing. The 5 major crime families of the American Eastern Seaboard sat down together, ate food they could afford to waste, drank wine that cost more than most people's cars, and reminded each other, through toasts and handshakes and carefully worded silences, that the arrangement still held, that the peace was still peace, that nobody was going to do anything stupid. It was the one night when everyone was supposed to behave. Seraphine had attended 11 of them. She knew the room by muscle memory at this point. The way the chandelier light hit the east wall different from the west, the particular echo that came off the marble floor when too many people were talking at once, the table arrangement that put the Castellano family always slightly closer to the exit than anyone else, a detail that had taken her 3 years to notice and another 2 to understand the significance of. She was wearing the charcoal silk that Lucian had once told her made her look like she owned the city. She'd chosen it deliberately, not for him, for herself, and for the 11 capos who would notice, and for Elena Voss from the Brennan family who had eyes like a hawk and a memory longer than most people's criminal careers. Lucian was at the head of the table, which was where Lucian always was. He'd been the Don of the Draven family for 9 years, and in that time he'd expanded the family's reach from New York into Baltimore, Philadelphia, and the outer edges of Boston. He was 44 years old, physically large, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that came from never having faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Seraphine was 39. She had been married to him for 14 years. She noticed Vivienne Moreau the moment the woman entered the room, because Seraphine noticed everything, and because Vivienne was the kind of woman who entered rooms in a way that made not noticing her a genuine act of discipline. She was in red, a choice that read less like fashion and more like a declaration. And she moved through the crowd the way water moves through a space it has decided to fill. Seraphine had known about Vivienne for 8 months. She'd known, and she'd waited, and she'd said nothing, because silence had always been her sharpest instrument. You don't reveal what you know until you know what your knowledge is worth. The dinner progressed the way these dinners always did. The food came out in courses. The men talked business in the language of implication, never saying what they meant, only what they could deny. Mario Castellano made a joke about fishing that everyone laughed at because everyone understood it wasn't about fishing. Theo Brennan's son drank too much and had to be quietly redirected by his father's second. Raphael Okafor from the Port Authority family sat at the far corner and said almost nothing, which meant he was either bored or furious, and with Raphael it was always one or the other. Seraphine watched all of it. She ate what was put in front of her. She spoke when spoken to, asked questions when questions were useful, and said nothing when saying nothing was the correct move. She was thinking about the meeting she'd had 3 weeks ago with a man named Aldo, who was 71 years old and had once been the most feared enforcer in the Draven organization before Lucian had pushed him into retirement. Aldo had met her at a coffee shop in Queens and said, without preamble, "You should know there are people who are paying attention, Mrs. Draven." He hadn't explained what he meant. He hadn't needed to. She was thinking about the ledgers. She was thinking about the 17-page document she had memorized, not kept on paper, just memorized, that contained the routing information for 6 different financial networks spanning 4 countries. She was thinking about the call she'd received from a federal judge named Harmon 2 days earlier, the call that had lasted exactly 4 minutes and had consisted almost entirely of a phone number she wasn't supposed to write down. She was doing all of this thinking while appearing to listen to Elena Voss describe a property dispute in Atlantic City, and she was doing it with the kind of surface serenity that had taken her years to develop, and that Lucian had long ago stopped interpreting as anything other than passivity. That was his first mistake. It was not his last. The shift happened during the third course. Lucien stood up. That alone was unusual. He didn't typically make announcements at the banquet, because the banquet wasn't a venue for announcements. It was a venue for atmosphere. The room quieted with the particular speed of people who have trained themselves to be alert to changes in environment. "I want to say something," Lucian said. His voice was steady. She'd give him that. Whatever he'd been planning, he'd prepared for it, practiced it, worked out the delivery. He had the focused look he got before something he'd decided he had the right to do. Seraphine set down her fork. Not because she was anxious, because she'd learned a long time ago that when Lucian Draven stood up to make an announcement, your hands should be empty and visible. It was a small habit born from a very specific kind of wariness. The wariness of a woman who had spent 14 years learning the difference between the Lucian who was making a calculated move and the Lucian who had convinced himself his impulses were strategy. "This family has always understood that power needs a face," Lucian said. "Something visible, something that communicates authority in a room like this one, where everybody knows what the symbols mean." He was looking at Vivian. Seraphine understood what was happening approximately 2 seconds before it happened. 2 seconds isn't long. It's long enough to make a choice about your face. She made the choice. Lucian reached into his jacket pocket and produced the dawn ring. It was not a subtle object. It never had been. Heavy gold, beveled edge, the Draven family crest engraved so deep you could feel it with your thumb. Lucian's father had worn it. His grandfather before that. In the world of the American syndicates, the dawn ring was as close to a crown as anything got, and everyone in that room knew exactly what it meant. He carried it across the ballroom floor. 30 feet, maybe, between his chair and where Vivian was standing, and the only sound was the click of his shoes on the marble and the creak of 300 people simultaneously holding their breath. He stopped in front of Vivian. He slid the ring onto her finger. "The new queen of the Draven family," he said. For a moment, nothing. Then the laughter started. Not from everyone. Some people in that room had the wit or the awareness to understand that this was a significant and potentially catastrophic event dressed up as a romantic gesture. But from enough people that it spread, and once laughter spreads in a room, it takes on its own momentum. Seraphine felt 300 pairs of eyes move to her face. She had 2 seconds, maybe 3, before the way she responded to this moment became the story people told about it for the next decade. She understood that completely. She understood it the way you understand the specific mechanics of the trap you have just stepped into. She reached up. She removed her own wedding band. Not dramatically, not with tears or a thrown glass or the kind of reaction that would have given Lucian the satisfaction of a scene. She removed it the way you remove something that has outlived its purpose, and she set it on the table beside her plate, and she stood up and she walked out of the ballroom. She did not look at Vivian. She did not look at Lucian. She looked at the exit, and she walked to it, and behind her she could hear the whisper spreading through the room like a slow fire. "Fire, the queen has fallen, the queen has fallen. Did you see her face?" She didn't even... What she heard, underneath all of that, was the silence of the oldest capos. The ones who had been there since before Lucian. The ones who remembered his father and his grandfather, and the original arrangement that had built everything the Draven name stood on. The men who knew where all of it came from. Not a single one of them laughed. She didn't turn around to check. She didn't need to. She'd spent enough years in that world to feel the texture of a room's silence, and the silence from that corner of the ballroom had a particular weight to it. The weight of men who were not surprised. The weight of men who had been expecting something, and were now watching to see if this was finally it. The night air outside the hotel hit her like cold water. She stood on the sidewalk for 30 seconds with her eyes closed and her breathing controlled. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the technique she'd learned from a woman named Marguerite, who'd trained Special Forces interrogation resistance, and who had told Seraphine, over coffee in a safe house in Newark 6 years ago, that the only thing that matters in the first 30 seconds after a shock is oxygen. And then she opened her eyes and she walked to the car, and she got in. Her driver, a man named Cass, who had been with her for 9 years and who understood that his job sometimes included not asking questions, said nothing. He pulled away from the curb and drove. For the first 20 minutes, Seraphine said nothing. Then she said, "Take me to the storage facility on Halsey." Cass took her to the storage facility on Halsey. It was a climate-controlled unit, 6 by 10, registered under a name that didn't exist, paid for 18 months in advance in cash. Inside it, 4 external hard drives, 2 encrypted phones, both charged, neither registered, a fireproof document case containing physical copies of things she'd hoped she would never need to use, $40,000 in mixed bills, a single prepaid card with a particular phone number written on a post-it note stuck to the back of it. She stood in the storage unit for a moment, looking at what she'd assembled over 4 years of quiet preparation, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a woman has been paying attention. Then she took out one of the phones, typed a message to a contact listed only as A, and sent it. The message was 3 words. The ring moved. She waited. 40 seconds. 50. The reply came back in under a minute. We know. We've been ready. She put the phone in her coat pocket. She locked the storage unit. She went back to the car. The apartment, she told Cass. Not the house. She had 3 apartments in the city that Lucien didn't know about. The habit had started practically. There were times when she needed to work without the interruption of household staff and security rotations and Lucien's unpredictable schedule. And over the years, it had become something else entirely. Evidence of a very specific kind of foresight. The apartment on the 14th floor of a building in Chelsea was spare and clean and contained exactly what she needed: a desk, a secure internet connection, a phone line, and silence. She sat down at the desk, and she opened the laptop that lived there, and she stared at the screen for a long moment without typing anything. She was thinking about the night Lucien's father, Dominic Draven, had taken her aside. This was before the wedding, before the engagement even, before Lucien had officially introduced her to anyone in his world, and told her in the private study of the Draven estate in Connecticut that he'd had her investigated. She had been 24. She'd looked right at him and said, "What did you find?" He'd said, "Everything your father tried to hide, and some things he didn't know about himself." She'd said, "Then you know I can do this." He'd looked at her for a long time, Dominic Draven, with his heavy hands and his careful eyes, and he'd said, "There's something I need to show you." What he'd shown her had changed everything. The covenant was not a document most people in the American underworld had ever seen or knew existed. It was old, genuinely old, drafted in a hotel room in Chicago in 1947 by the founding representatives of 6 crime families, including the original head of what would become the Draven organization. It laid out the terms of the American Syndicate Alliance in language that was meticulous and specific, and for its era, shockingly forward-thinking. And it contained a provision that no one had needed to invoke in 70 years. The Keeper of the Covenant. A designated bloodline, not a family, not a dynasty, but a specific lineage that crossed family lines, entrusted with the original document and with the authority to invoke it in the event that the alliance was threatened from within. Dominic Draven had looked at her and said, quietly, "Your grandmother's name is in this document, Seraphine. Did you know that?" She hadn't known. She'd spent the next 3 years finding out everything she could, through channels that cost her considerable effort, and occasionally, small amounts of money that came out of her own pocket so there was no record. What she'd found had rewritten her understanding of her own family history entirely. She was the last living heir of the Ashcroft lineage. She was the keeper of the covenant. Dominic had told her this, and then he'd told her something else. "My son will never understand it. He thinks power is the ring. He thinks it's the name, the territory, the number of soldiers who answer when you call. And doesn't understand that everything he has exists because someone else built the architecture that made it possible." He'd paused. "I'm asking you to marry him because I need someone in this family who understands what I understand, even if he never does." She'd asked him what happened if things went wrong. He'd said, "That's why you need to know." She had spent 14 years being Lucien Draven's wife. She had managed his household and attended his events and sat at his table and, in the process, quietly, methodically, built and maintained the financial and political infrastructure that kept his empire functional. She had negotiated 2 peace treaties that he thought had been negotiated by his capos. She had rerouted 3 financial networks to protect the family from a federal investigation that had come within 6 weeks of bringing everything down. She had cultivated relationships with judges, senators, Port Authority officials, shipping executives, and the retired enforcers who had collective institutional knowledge going back to the founding of the Alliance. She had done all of this without attribution, without credit, and without complaint, because that was what was required. And she had watched, over the last 18 months, as Lucien became increasingly reckless. As Vivian entered his orbit and his judgment degraded in the specific way that happened to powerful men who became convinced that their power was a personal attribute rather than a structural one. She had watched him make decisions that weakened alliances, antagonized partners, and created vulnerabilities that she then had to quietly address from behind the scenes, so that the damage was contained and he never had to face the consequences directly. She'd thought more than once about what Dominic had said in the Connecticut study, about what he'd known and what he'd asked her to do, and why. She opened the encrypted drive on the laptop. She accessed the file she hadn't opened in 4 years. She read through it, not because she'd forgotten anything, but because this was the moment when accuracy mattered absolutely, and she needed to be certain. And then she opened a new document, and she began to write a series of names. Aldo, Marguerite, Judge Harmon, Elena Voss. Elena was a complicated entry. Elena's loyalty was conditional, and Elena knew it, and so did Seraphine, but conditional loyalty was still usable if you were precise about the conditions. Raphael Okafor. Raphael had said almost nothing at dinner tonight, and Seraphine had spent the car ride thinking about what his silence meant. She thought she knew. She needed to confirm it. There were 11 other names on the list by the time she stopped writing. She stared at the list. Downstairs, somewhere in the city, 300 people were talking about what had happened in that ballroom. Lucien was probably drinking and feeling like he'd done something decisive. Vivian was probably wearing the dawn ring and letting people come to her. Everyone believed the queen had fallen. Seraphine looked at the list of names on the screen. She thought about the Covenant and the 14 years, and the cold storage unit on Halsey Street, and the old capos who had not laughed. She thought about the ring. It was gold. It was heavy. It had the family crest engraved into it. Lucien had worn it on his right hand for 9 years, and his father before him, and his grandfather before that. It was a symbol. It was a very good symbol. She understood exactly what it communicated and why it mattered, and she had no contempt for it. But Dominic Draven had told her something on a night in Connecticut a long time ago, when she was 24 years old and didn't yet know who she was. He'd said, "The ring commands soldiers." He'd said, "What you carry commands everything else." She saved the document. She closed the laptop. She picked up the phone, and she made the first call. The first call lasted 9 minutes. Aldo picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd already heard. In Aldo's world, news from a room full of 300 dangerous people traveled faster than the people themselves. And Aldo had spent 50 years building a network of ears that functioned even in retirement. "I saw it coming," he said, without preamble. 3 months ago, maybe 4. The way he started cutting people out of meetings. The way the money started moving different. A pause. "You all right?" "I'm working," Seraphine said. Another pause, shorter this time. "Yeah," Aldo said. "Okay." They agreed to meet the following morning, not at the coffee shop in Queens, somewhere else, a diner in Astoria that Aldo knew, that had a back room, that had been used for exactly this kind of conversation, going back to a time before Seraphine was born. She wrote down the address even though she didn't need to. The act of writing it made it real in a way that mattered. She made 2 more calls that night. Both went to voicemail. Both got the same message, wordless, just a specific tone pattern she'd established years ago as a contact protocol that meant, "When you're ready, I'm moving." Then she went to sleep. Not because she was calm, because she was disciplined, and because the next several weeks were going to require a physical stamina she couldn't afford to drain by sitting awake in a Chelsea apartment replaying 30 seconds of ballroom humiliation in her head. She'd replayed it once, in the car. That was enough. She understood what had happened. She understood what it meant. What she needed now was sleep and a clear head at 6 in the morning. She slept 5 hours and 20 minutes. She knew the exact duration because she'd trained herself to wake without an alarm. And her internal clock had the grim precision of someone who'd spent too many years operating on contingency schedules. She made coffee. She read through 3 encrypted messages that had arrived overnight. She showered and dressed and was in the car by 6:40. Aldo was already at the diner when she arrived. He was a big man who had gone soft in the way that very physically capable men go soft in their 70s. Not weakly, but like something that had simply settled into itself and stopped needing to prove anything. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and a plate he hadn't touched. And when she sat down across from him, he studied her face the way you study a structural wall when you're trying to figure out if it's load-bearing. "You look the same," he said. "I am the same." "That's what I mean." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He gave her the ring in front of everyone. Yes. In front of the Castellanos, the Brennans, Raphael. "I was there, Aldo." "I know you were there." His jaw tightened. "I'm saying it because I want you to understand that I understand what that means. What he did last night, that wasn't a domestic situation. That was a declaration. He's telling every family in the alliance that the Draven seat has a new face, and he didn't ask anyone, and he didn't negotiate, and he didn't even have the basic courtesy to—" He stopped, set down the coffee cup. "It's going to bleed. You know that. That's why I called you." Aldo looked at her for a long moment. The diner around them had the low, clattering morning noise of a place that served real food to people who worked with their hands, and no one at any of the nearby tables had any idea that the two people in the back booth were discussing the potential restructuring of a criminal empire that moved somewhere in the range of $4 billion annually. "The old guys," Aldo said carefully, "the ones who were at the banquet last night, Ferrante, Maurizio, Sal B." None of them laughed. Something moved across Aldo's face. Not surprise, closer to confirmation. "Ferrante called me at midnight," he said. "You know what he said?" She waited. "He said, 'She walked out clean.'" Aldo picked up his coffee again. That was all. 4 words. Then he hung up. Seraphine absorbed this without showing what it did to her. Ferrante was 78 years old and had been with the Draven family since before Lucian's father took the seat. His opinion carried the particular weight of someone who had seen everything and chosen to say almost nothing for 4 decades. 4 words from Ferrante Lucio were the equivalent of a speech from anyone else. "I need a meeting," she said. "Not by phone, in person. Anyone who matters, anyone who's been paying attention, anyone who's already running the calculation about what happens to their arrangements when this goes sideways." She paused. "It will go sideways. Vivian has been making promises she can't keep. I know because I know which promises were already made, by me, to people she doesn't know exist." Aldo was quiet for a moment. "How long do you need?" 2 weeks? He nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls." She paid for breakfast and left. By the time she reached the car, her phone had 3 new messages. One from Lucian's chief of staff, bland, carefully worded, essentially a corporate memo informing her that her access codes to the family's main financial systems had been suspended, pending administrative review. She read it twice, then put the phone in her bag. Pending administrative review. She thought about the 17 routing networks she'd designed, the encrypted ledgers she'd memorized, the judges and Port Authority officials and shipping executives who took her calls and not Lucian's because they had never met Lucian. She thought about the fact that suspending her access codes was like changing the locks on a house, while the person you'd locked out had spent 10 years quietly memorizing the floor plan, the structural weak points, and the location of every spare key ever cut. Then she thought about the fact that somewhere across the city, Vivienne Moreau had woken up this morning wearing the dawn ring and believing that made her dangerous. She almost felt something like pity. Almost. The news broke by noon. Not all of it. Not the private mechanics. Not what had been said and done in that ballroom. But enough. The underworld had its own version of media, which was faster and more accurate than anything that ran on a network, because the people who dealt in information there dealt in it the way they dealt in everything else, as a commodity with a price, and they didn't waste it on imprecision. By noon, the story circulating through every significant criminal organization on the eastern seaboard was that Lucian Draven had publicly installed his mistress as the face of the Draven family at the most important annual gathering of the American Syndicate, in front of every major power player, without prior consultation or negotiation. The reactions were varied and, in aggregate, deeply alarming for Lucian. Mario Castellano put a hold on 3 pending agreements with the Draven family. He didn't announce it, he simply stopped responding to messages, which was the Castellano way of expressing serious displeasure without committing to a position. Theo Brennan's office sent a message through an intermediary asking for clarification on the status of 2 financial arrangements that had been negotiated the previous spring. The message was polite. The question underneath it was not. Raphael Okafor, in the way of a man who had been watching a fire approach for some time and had already quietly moved everything valuable out of its path, said nothing at all. Which Seraphine, when she heard about it through a contact she maintained within the Okafor family's financial structure, understood immediately. Raphael wasn't waiting to see what happened. Raphael had already decided what he was going to do. He was simply waiting for the right moment. Vivian, operating from the Draven estate on Long Island with what Seraphine was told was considerable visible confidence, dispatched 3 of Lucian's senior soldiers to deliver messages to the Castellano and Brennan families. The messages were, by all accounts, a mixture of reassurance and veiled pressure, a combination that managed to be both condescending and unconvincing, which was a particular skill set. The Castellanos sent the soldiers back. Not harmed, just back. Seraphine heard about this through Marguerite, who maintained connections Seraphine had cultivated over years, and who had the rare gift of being able to move through the upper reaches of organized crime as though she were simply a well-dressed woman of a certain age with a lot of acquaintances. Marguerite called her on one of the encrypted phones and said, without emotional coloring, "The Castellano soldiers told your husband's men that they would communicate with the head of the Draven family directly, or not at all." And Vivian? Vivian told them Lucien was unavailable. A pause. "He's unavailable," Seraphine said. "Apparently he's been difficult to reach since this morning. There's a theory he's angry about how things went last night. There's another theory that Vivian is managing his access to information." That landed differently than anything else had. Seraphine stood very still for a moment, in the middle of the Chelsea apartment, phone pressed to her ear, and processed what Marguerite had just told her. Vivian managing Lucien's access to information meant Vivian was already playing a deeper game than Seraphine had anticipated. It meant the woman wasn't simply a mistress who'd been handed a symbol and told she was queen. It meant there was a strategy operating, someone else's strategy, with Vivian as the visible face of it. You didn't manage information access on the first full day of a new power arrangement unless you'd been planning for this moment. Unless someone had been planning it for you. "Who's around her?" Seraphine said. It wasn't a question. "That's the part I'm still working on," Marguerite said. "But there's a name that's come up twice. Aldrich Sable." Seraphine's jaw tightened. Aldrich Sable was not, technically speaking, a criminal. He was a consultant, a fixer, in the specific sense of someone who arranged structural solutions to complex problems for people who could afford his rates, which were high enough to function as a filter. He was Belgian, originally, had spent time in London and Singapore, and had arrived in New York approximately 3 years ago with an impressive list of clients that crossed several different categories of powerful and several different categories of dangerous. He was intelligent, discreet, and completely without loyalty to anyone or anything except the terms of whatever arrangement he was currently being paid to honor. The fact that his name had come up in connection with Vivian twice meant that someone had been building this for a while. It meant Vivian hadn't simply been Lucian's mistress. She'd been a mechanism, a designed one. "Keep working on it," Seraphine said. She hung up and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the city below. Then she picked up the other phone and sent a message to the contact labeled JH, Judge Harmon, that said only, "I need the meeting moved up, this week if possible." The reply came back in 11 minutes. Thursday. My office. Noon. She had 9 days. Lucian came to the Chelsea apartment on Tuesday. She hadn't told him where it was. She hadn't needed to. He had resources, and when he decided he wanted to find something, he generally found it, and the fact that it had taken him 4 days was itself a data point. She filed away carefully. He knocked. She answered the door. They stood looking at each other in the doorway for a moment with the particular awkwardness of two people who have spent 14 years in the same space and are suddenly encountering each other as adversaries rather than domestic fixtures. He looked tired. That was the first thing she noticed. He had the specific exhaustion of a man who had done something he couldn't undo, and was only now beginning to understand the full weight of what he'd set in motion. "Can I come in?" he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He looked around the apartment, seeing it for the first time, registering its spareness, the lack of decoration, the desk with the laptop, the second phone charging on the counter. His expression moved through several things without settling on any of them. "How long have you had this place?" he said. 7 years. He absorbed that. Seraphine, don't, she said. Flat. No heat, no grief. Just the word, with the authority of someone who had decided what this conversation was and wasn't going to be. He stopped. His jaw moved. He had the look of a man who had prepared something to say and was now recalibrating because the room he'd walked into wasn't the room he'd expected. The Castellanos are frozen, he said. The Brennans are asking questions I can't answer. Raphael hasn't returned 3 calls. He spread his hands, a gesture that managed to be simultaneously frustrated and in some way she couldn't fully articulate, plaintive. Things are moving in a direction I didn't— You gave the ring to someone who doesn't know what it costs, Seraphine said, in front of everyone who matters, and now you're surprised that people are recalculating. It wasn't— He stopped again, started differently. She's not what you think she is. I think she's a mechanism, Seraphine said. I think someone built her into your life with a specific intention, and I think you were too distracted by what she looks like and how she makes you feel to notice. I think Aldrich Sable has been in this from the beginning, and I think you should ask yourself who Aldrich Sable is working for, because it isn't you. The name hit him. She watched it land, watched something move behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of a fear he'd been avoiding. How do you know about Sable? Because I know everything, Lucian. Not unkindly, almost gently. I have always known everything. That's the arrangement your father made. That's what I've been, for 14 years, whether you understood it or not. He was quiet for a long time. The apartment was very still. Outside the window, the city made its constant noise, traffic, voices, the distant machinery of a place that doesn't slow down for personal disasters. Tell me what to do, he said finally. And that was what broke something in her. Not the ring, not the ballroom, not the laughter. This. Because she could see that he meant it, completely and without irony, and that what he was asking was for her to fix it the way she had always fixed things, quietly and from behind him, without credit, without acknowledgement, without even the basic dignity of being told he understood what she did. No, she said. He blinked. Seraphine. I'm not going to tell you what to do, Lucian. You made a choice in that ballroom. Now you live in it. She held his gaze. I have my own work. He left 20 minutes later. She stood at the window and watched the car pull away from the curb and merge into traffic and disappear. And she thought about what his face had looked like when she said no. And she thought, good. Let him feel what it is to be without the thing that was holding everything up. The Thursday meeting with Judge Harmon was 45 minutes and produced 3 things. Confirmation of a federal investigation timeline that gave her a 6-week window, a sealed court document that she had no intention of opening yet but that needed to exist in her possession, and the name of a contact within the Department of Justice whom Harmon described as sympathetic to structural arguments about syndicate governance, which was the most careful way anyone had ever said what Harmon was saying. She walked out of the federal building into afternoon sunlight and immediately called Elena Voss. Elena picked up on the 4th ring, which meant she was making Seraphine wait deliberately. Which was fine, because Elena Voss always made people wait deliberately, and you didn't take it personally, you just counted it as part of the cost of access. I wondered when you'd call, Elena said. I need to know where the Brennan family stands. The Brennan family stands wherever the Brennan family's interests stand, Elena said, which was the Elena Voss way of saying, make me an argument. Vivian's been making approaches to the Brennan financial arrangements, Seraphine said. I know because 2 of those arrangements route through networks I designed, and she doesn't know that. If she restructures them the way she's planning to, she'll trip a federal flag inside of 3 weeks. Silence on the line. The particular weighted silence of someone recalculating. You're sure, Elena said. I built the architecture, yes, I'm sure. Another pause. What do you want? Patience, Seraphine said. 2 more weeks. Tell Brennan not to respond to any Draven proposals until he hears from me directly. And if he asks why he should take direction from Lucian Draven's estranged wife, instead of from whoever's currently wearing the Dawn Ring? Seraphine thought about the covenant in the fireproof case on Halsey Street. She thought about her grandmother's name in a document drafted in 1947. She thought about Dominic Draven in the Connecticut study, telling her, what you carry commands everything else. Tell him, she said, that the ring was always ceremonial. She could hear Elena processing this. could hear, underneath the silence, the specific quality of a very intelligent woman encountering a piece of information that recontextualizes everything she thought she understood. "I'll tell him," Elena said. The weekend brought the first violence. A Draven soldier named Petrov was found in a parked car in the Red Hook neighborhood with 2 bullets in him, placed with a precision that suggested professional work rather than a dispute. He wasn't dead. Whoever did it had been careful to make it a message rather than an execution. But he was in surgery for 6 hours and in critical condition for 2 days after that. Petrov was not a senior figure. He was 31 years old and had been with the Draven family for 4 years, and his primary function was logistics. Moving money between locations, maintaining relationships with 2 specific financial intermediaries who handled the laundering structure for the Brooklyn operation. He wasn't important enough to target unless the point of targeting him was precisely that he wasn't important. Unless the point was to show that the Draven organization had a visibility problem, that someone knew enough about its structure to surgically remove mid-level components. Seraphine heard about it through Aldo, who called her on Sunday morning with the particular tone of someone delivering information they find deeply troubling. "Petrov," she said. "You know him?" "I know what he did. I know why he mattered." She paused. "This wasn't the Castellanos or the Brennans." "No," Aldo said. "The method is wrong for either of them. This is—" He stopped. "This feels like something from outside." "Sable," she said, "or whoever Sable is working for." She thought about the word Marguerite had used, outside. She thought about the approaches Vivian had been making to the other families, the restructuring proposals, the way everything Vivian touched seemed to be designed not just to consolidate Draven power, but to redraw the lines of the existing arrangement entirely. You didn't redraw those lines without a reason. You didn't bring in a fixer like Aldrich Sable, who cost more than most criminal organizations earned in a quarter, unless you had something very specific in mind. "I need to know who Sable's principal is," she said, "not who's paying him here, who he answers to ultimately." "That's a hard ask." "I know." "Give me a few days." The few days cost her. While she waited, Vivian made 2 more moves. The first was a restructuring proposal to the Okafor family that, on its surface, appeared to offer them better terms on their existing arrangement with the Draven family's Port Authority connections. Underneath the surface, it would have given Vivian effective oversight of Okafor's independent shipping lines, a detail buried deep enough in the language that it required the specific kind of financial literacy that most of the men in these rooms didn't have. Raphael Okafor was not most men. He sent back a counterproposal written in language so precisely demolishing of the original that it functioned as both a rejection and a warning. Seraphine heard about it from Marguerite and felt something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the neighborhood. The second move was more alarming. Vivian had Seraphine's name removed from the lease of the storage facility on Halsey Street. Not the unit itself. It was still there, still locked, still registered under the non-existent name. But a document trail that Seraphine had thought was airtight had apparently been found and quietly modified, which meant someone had gone looking, which meant someone had resources and access that went beyond Lucian's organization, which meant the thing she'd suspected about the outside involvement was not a suspicion anymore. She found out on Monday morning, 9 days after the banquet. She found out because she went to the facility and the manager, a man she'd dealt with for 3 years without incident, told her, with visible discomfort, that there had been an administrative inquiry about the unit over the weekend and that he'd been instructed to note any visitors. She thanked him. She walked to the car. She sat in the back seat for 3 minutes, breathing carefully, doing the math. If they knew about the storage facility, they'd been watching her for at least 2 weeks before the banquet, possibly longer. Which meant the banquet itself, the ring, the public humiliation, all of it, had been timed. Designed to look like Lucian's impulsiveness and vanity, which wasn't hard because those things were real, but engineered to produce a specific outcome. Seraphine isolated, without access to resources, dealing with the emotional aftermath of a public humiliation while Vivian consolidated power. It was actually a very good plan. She pulled out the first of the encrypted phones and sent a message to Aldo. "Move the timeline. I need the meeting this week." She sent a second message to Marguerite. "I need everything you have on Sable by tomorrow morning, everything." She sat in the back of the car on a Monday morning in November and looked out at the street and thought, All right. They know more than I thought. They've been at this longer than I knew. Then she thought, but they don't know what I carry. Aldo's reply came back in 4 minutes. It's Wednesday. Ferrante can do Wednesday. Sal too. I'll get the others. Wednesday was 2 days away. She spent those 2 days moving carefully, deliberately, and completely under the surface, visiting people in person rather than by phone, using routes that had no pattern, varying her timing so there was nothing to track. She met a man named Doyle who had handled the Draven family's relationship with 3 federal judges for 15 years and who owed her a specific debt from a specific situation 4 years prior. She met a woman named Cassia who ran the most significant private banking relationship in the family's financial structure and who, when Seraphine sat across from her in a hotel bar in Midtown, and explained in precise terms that the new arrangements Vivienne was proposing would create a catastrophic federal exposure, went very still and said, "How long have you known about this?" "Long enough," Seraphine said. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because now is when it matters." Cassia looked at her for a long time. "What do you need?" "I need you to freeze the restructuring process. Don't block it. That will alert them. Just slow it. Find administrative reasons. Buy me a week. And then? And then I'll handle the rest." Wednesday came cold and gray, the kind of November morning that felt like the city was conserving its energy for something it knew was coming. The meeting was in a private room above an Italian restaurant in Carroll Gardens that had been in Ferrante Lucio's family for 40 years. Not as a front, just as a restaurant, one of the few legitimate things in the orbit of that particular world. And Ferrante kept it that way because he understood the value of one clean thing. There were 7 people in the room. Aldo, Ferrante himself, 78 years old and carved from something harder than most people encountered in their lifetimes. Sal Benedetto, who had handled Draven family security operations for 2 decades. A man named Piers, who ran the family's relationship with the Teamsters, and who had the quiet, deliberate manner of someone who had spent his career counting to 10 before he spoke. Elena Voss, who had come in from the Brennan side with the explicit authorization of Theo Brennan himself, which was significant enough that Seraphine had spent a moment absorbing it when Aldo told her. And 2 others she hadn't expected, a man named Croak from the Castellano organization, and most surprisingly, a representative of Raphael Okafor's family named Daniel Ash, who was 35 and had the stillness of someone who had been given very specific instructions and intended to follow them precisely. Seraphine sat at one end of the table. She looked at all of them. "You're here," she said, "because you already know something is wrong. You've known it since the banquet, and some of you have known it longer. I'm not here to convince you of something you've already figured out. I'm here to tell you what you don't know yet." Ferrante's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this room for a long time. She told them about Sable. She told them about the storage facility, the modified documents, the surgical precision of the Petrov shooting. She told them about the restructuring proposals, the ones the Okafor family had already seen, and the ones the Castellano and Brennan families hadn't received yet, but would in the next 48 hours, buried inside language designed to look like standard consolidation. She told them what she believed Sable's principle was, what the endgame looked like from the outside. The room was silent for a long time when she finished. Then Ferrante said, in the rough, unhurried way of a man who never wasted syllables, "The covenant." Not a question. "Yes," she said. "You have it. I have it." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Old, specific. The particular expression of someone who has been carrying a piece of knowledge for a very long time and is now watching it matter in the way they always believed it would. "Dominic told me about you," Ferrante said quietly, "before he died. He said, if it ever gets bad enough, there's a woman who knows where everything is buried." He said it like it was the only thing he was certain of. Seraphine felt the weight of that land somewhere in her chest. She held it there. She didn't let it show. "Here's what I need," she said, "from all of you. Here's what the next 2 weeks have to look like." She laid it out. Precisely, completely, without hedging. The meeting with the assassination attempt she already knew was coming. She'd intercepted the contract through Doyle 3 days ago and had made a decision about it that she hadn't told anyone yet. The Council of Shadows, which was 6 weeks away, and which Vivienne was already positioning to use as her coronation. The Covenant, and what invoking it would mean, and what it would require from each family in that room. No one interrupted. When she finished, Daniel Ash, Raphael Okafor's man, looked at her and said, "Mr. Okafor wants to know one thing. Ask. He wants to know if you're doing this to take the power back for the Draven family, or for something else." She held his gaze. "The Draven family," she said, "is Lucy N's problem. What I'm doing this for is the Alliance. The same thing your family's founding representatives signed their names to in 1947. The same thing that's kept everyone in this room standing for the last 70 years. She paused. "Vivian isn't trying to run the Draven family. She's a door. Someone on the other side of it is trying to walk through." The room absorbed this. "Wednesday next week," Aldo said. "We meet again. By then I'll have confirmation on Sable's principle." Nods around the table. Not enthusiastic. These were not enthusiastic men, but deliberate. The particular weighted commitment of people who understood what they were agreeing to. Seraphine drove back to Chelsea through the gray November afternoon and sat at the desk in the apartment and opened the laptop. She opened the file with the 11 names on it. She added 4 more. Then she opened a second file, one she'd created years ago and never used, never expected to use, the one she'd described to herself privately as the contingency for the contingency. And she read through it for the first time in 3 years. When she finished, she closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet apartment for a while, thinking about Lucian's face when he'd stood in her doorway and asked her to tell him what to do. Thinking about Dominic in the Connecticut study. Thinking about the covenant in the fireproof case, her grandmother's signature reproduced in the founding document of something that had lasted 70 years. She thought about the contract on her life that she'd intercepted through Doyle 3 days ago. The contract that Vivian had issued. The contract she'd let exist deliberately because a contract you know about is a trap you control. She picked up the phone and made a call to a man named Rennick, who was not affiliated with any of the families in that Carroll Gardens room, who worked freelance and who had done 3 jobs for her over the past 6 years. Not violence, never violence, something more specific. The particular skill set of someone who could make arrangements hold or fall apart at the precise moment you needed them to. "I need you ready," she said. 10 days. "Ready for what?" "They're going to send someone after me," she said. "And when they do, I need it to go a very specific way." "How specific?" "Specific enough that when it's over, Vivian thinks she's won," Seraphine said. "And every assassin she's sent comes back to me instead." Rennick called her on the 7th day. Not the 10th. The 7th. Which meant they'd moved the timeline, which meant something had changed in Vivian's camp, which meant Seraphine had 3 fewer days than she'd planned for and no clean way to compensate. She was in the Astoria diner when the call came. The same back booth, different morning, the same clattering noise of a place that didn't know or care what was being discussed inside it. She picked up on the first ring. "Tonight," Rennick said. She set down her coffee. "How many?" "2, professional, not local." A pause. "Belgian methodology, if that means anything to you." It meant everything to her. Belgian methodology meant Sable's people, which meant Vivian hadn't hired street muscle or even family soldiers. She'd gone straight to the professional infrastructure, which said something about either her confidence or her impatience, and Seraphine wasn't certain which was more dangerous. "The arrangement still holds," she said. "Your end has to be exact," Rennick said. "These aren't people you stall. You either play it correctly or, I know what happens if I don't play it correctly," she said. She hung up. She sat in the booth for 90 seconds, finishing her coffee, going through the mechanics of the evening in her head. The route she'd take home, the timing, the 2 variables she couldn't control and had therefore built redundancy around. Rennick had 2 people positioned at points along the route who would do nothing except observe and, if things went wrong in a specific way, intervene in a specific way. The word "if" carried a significant amount of weight. She paid for the coffee and left. The evening unfolded with the particular unreality of a situation you've prepared for extensively, but that still feels, when it's happening, nothing like the preparation. She took a car to the Chelsea apartment, went upstairs, spent 40 minutes at the desk doing actual work, messages, a set of financial documents she needed to review before the following week's meeting. And then at 9:15, she left the building and walked 3 blocks to a parking structure. She was in the stairwell of the structure, between the 2nd and 3rd floors, when they came for her. 2 men, fast, quiet, the specific economy of movement that you didn't develop casually. This was trained efficiency, the kind that came from repetition and from operating in environments where hesitation had consequences. The first one came from above, the second from behind, and in the half second between when she heard them and when they closed the distance, she made herself go still. Not frozen, still. There was a difference. What happened next took 4 minutes and was not clean or elegant or anything like what people imagined when they imagined this kind of thing. It was loud in the wrong places and silent in the wrong places, and by the end of it, both men were sitting on the concrete floor of the stairwell, one with a dislocated shoulder and one with a zip tie around his wrists, and what was going to be a significant headache for several days. Rennick materialized from somewhere she hadn't been tracking and looked at the two men and then at her and said, "You all right?" "Fine." She wasn't entirely fine. Her left hand was going to bruise badly where it had caught the wall, and there was something wrong with her breathing that suggested a cracked rib or close to it. But fine was the correct answer for the current moment. "They're going to need to call someone," she said. "I know. Make sure they have a working phone. Make sure they know the number to call." She looked at the man with the zip tie. He was conscious, watching her with the careful, recalibrating expression of a professional who had just discovered that the job was significantly different from the briefing. "Tell your employer," she said, "that you found me. Tell her what you walked into." The man said nothing. "Tell her," Seraphine said again, quietly, "that she should ask herself who built this." She walked out of the parking structure and got into the car where Cass was waiting and said, "Hospital. Nothing serious. I just need someone to look at my side." Cass drove without asking questions. At the hospital, a doctor confirmed 1 cracked rib and 2 bruised ones and told her to take it easy for 3 weeks, which she filed under information rather than instruction. She was back at the Chelsea apartment by midnight. She sat at the desk and composed a message to Aldo. "It happened, when as planned. They'll report back tonight." His reply came back in 6 minutes. "Ferrante wants to know if you're intact. Tell him yes," she sent back. "Tell him we're on schedule." She took 2 painkillers, the over-the-counter kind, because she needed to be functional in the morning and not foggy, and she lay down on the bed in the spare room and stared at the ceiling and thought about the 2 men in the parking structure. Thought about the fact that Sable had sent them. Thought about what it meant that Vivian had escalated to this within 10 days of the banquet, which was faster than Seraphine had projected even in her most aggressive planning scenario. She was thinking about this when the message arrived. Not on the encrypted phone. On the regular one. The number she'd had for years, publicly attached to her name, used for normal life. A message from a number she didn't recognize, which was unusual enough that she opened it immediately rather than leaving it for morning. The message was 4 words and a file attachment. The 4 words were, "You missed something, Seraphine." The file was a photograph. She opened it. The photograph showed a room she recognized. The private room above the Carroll Gardens restaurant, Ferrante's family place. The room where she'd held the meeting 8 days ago. 7 people around a table, and she could see herself at the head of it, and she could see Ferrante and Aldo and Elena Voss and all the others, and the angle of the photograph was from above and to the left, which meant it had been taken from the ventilation access above the drop ceiling in the northeast corner, which meant whoever had taken it had been in that building before the meeting. She put the phone down on the bed. She picked it up again. She looked at the photograph for a long time, at the faces, the table, the angle, at the quality of the image, which was high enough to have been taken with something significantly better than a phone camera, at the timestamp in the corner of the frame, which put it at 6:43 p.m. on the Wednesday of the meeting. The meeting had started at 7. Whoever took this had been in position for at least 17 minutes before anyone sat down. They'd known the location, the time, and the specific room, which meant they'd known before she did, because she hadn't confirmed the location until Tuesday evening, which meant the leak was inside the planning itself. Inside the 7 people in that room. She sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in her hand and made herself go through it methodically, because the alternative was a kind of panic she couldn't afford and had no intention of entertaining. She went through the 7 names. She went through the circumstances under which each of them had come to be in that room, who had brought them, what she knew about them, what she didn't know. She got to Daniel Ashe, Raphael Okafor's representative, and stopped. She went back to the beginning and thought about him again. The way he'd sat. The specific, focused stillness. She'd read as professional discipline, but could also be read as something else entirely. The single question he'd asked, on behalf of Okafor. He wants to know if you're doing this to take the power back for the Draven family, or for something else. A testing question. She'd understood it as Okafor wanting clarity on her intentions, but it could also be a diagnostic, a question designed to determine how much she'd reveal, how she framed her own position, what she considered central to the operation. She put the phone down again. She picked up the encrypted phone and called Marguerite. Marguerite answered on the third ring, and her voice when she said hello had the particular quality of someone who had been awake for some time already, which was itself a data point. "I need you to tell me everything you know about Daniel Ashe," Seraphine said. A pause. Not long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. But it was there. "What happened?" Marguerite said. "Someone photographed the Carroll Gardens meeting, from inside. I need to know who." "Daniel Ashe works directly for Raphael Okafor," Marguerite said, slowly, carefully. "He's been with Okafor for 6 years. Before that he was—" Another pause, longer. "Before that he was consulting work, private sector." "What kind of consulting?" Marguerite stopped. "I need to make a call. Give me an hour." Marguerite. "An hour, Seraphine. I need to check something, and I don't want to tell you a wrong thing at a wrong time." The line went quiet for a moment. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Stay that way for an hour." She hung up. Seraphine sat in the apartment and waited, which was one of the hardest things she had ever practiced making herself do. She was good at it. 14 years of being Lucian Draven's wife had made her expert at the performance of patience. But performance and the real thing were different, and right now the real thing felt like standing on ice that she couldn't see the thickness of. Marguerite called back in 53 minutes. "Daniel Ashe," she said without preamble. "Before Okafor, 3 years in Brussels. Logistics and security consulting for a private risk management firm called Ardent Group." The name hit Seraphine like cold water. Ardent Group was Aldrich Sable's company. She absorbed this completely, in silence, and for a long moment she didn't say anything, and Marguerite, who understood silences, let her have it. "Okafor doesn't know," Seraphine said finally. It wasn't a question. It was the only thing that made structural sense. If Okafor himself had been compromised, his behavior over the past 2 weeks had been an extraordinarily convincing performance of a man responding with genuine concern and independence. The counterproposal to Vivian's restructuring, the silence at the banquet, the message through Daniel Ashe that had read as cautious but legitimate. Raphael Okafor had a 30-year reputation for exactly the kind of careful, non-aligned intelligence that would make him indispensable to what Seraphine was building. If he was Sable's man, everything was already over. But Daniel Ashe was 35 and had worked for Ardent Group and was standing 6 feet to Okafor's left at all times. "Okafor doesn't know," Marguerite confirmed. "I'm as certain of that as I can be without asking him directly," Seraphine said. "Which we can't do." "Which we can't do. Not yet. Who else knows about Ashe's history?" "Nobody who's currently in your circle. I only found it because I know someone who knows someone, and I had to be very careful about how I asked." Marguerite's voice was steady but tight, in a way that Seraphine recognized as controlled anxiety. "Seraphine, if Ashe was in that room, if he photographed the meeting and sent it to Sable, then Sable knows who I've been talking to," Seraphine said. "He knows the configuration. He knows the timeline." She stopped. "He knows about the covenant." The word dropped into the space between them, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The covenant. She had mentioned it in that room. Not the specifics, not the language of the document, but she had said the word directly, and Ferrante had responded to it, and the nature of that exchange would have told anyone listening exactly what it represented and why it mattered. If Sable knew she had the covenant, he wasn't going to wait for the Council of Shadows to use it. He was going to move to neutralize it, which meant neutralizing her, before she could invoke it. The 2 men in the parking structure tonight hadn't been about sending a message. They'd been the first attempt of what was now going to be a systematic effort. "Marguerite," she said, "I need you to disappear for a while." "Seraphine, I'm serious. Not because you're compromised, because you're visible. Anyone who knows I've been making calls knows your name is somewhere in that list, and I need you out of the frame until this resolves." She paused. "I'll contact you through the protocol. You know the one." A long pause. All right, Marguerite said, with the voice of someone who didn't like the thing they were agreeing to, but understood why it was necessary. Be careful. Yes. She hung up. She sat in the quiet apartment and rebuilt the entire architecture of the past 2 weeks from the ground up, accounting for what she now knew. Every meeting, every call, every piece of information she'd shared and with whom. Every decision she'd made that had been informed by a strategic picture she was now understanding to be partially constructed from data that had been observed. The assessment was not good, not catastrophic. She caught herself at the edge of that word and pulled back from it deliberately, because catastrophic was what you called a situation when there was no rational path forward, and this was not that, but significantly worse than she'd understood 24 hours ago. The Carroll Gardens meeting had been a consolidation event. She'd brought people into alignment, laid out a framework, built toward the Council of Shadows as the moment of convergence. If Sable had that information, the timeline, the participants, the nature of the covenant, he had 6 weeks to dismantle each piece of it before she could use it. 6 weeks was a long time when you were the one dismantling. It was not a long time when you were the one being dismantled. She needed to move faster. She needed to change the shape of what she was doing so that the picture Sable currently had was no longer accurate. And she needed to deal with Daniel Ash in a way that didn't alert Sable that she knew, because the moment Sable understood his asset had been identified, he would accelerate. She picked up the encrypted phone and sent a message to Aldo. We have a problem. Need to meet. Not Carroll Gardens. Then she did something she had been avoiding for 10 days. She called Lucien. He picked up on the second ring, and the quality of his hello told her he'd been awake, and the way he said her name when he realized it was her told her more than she wanted to know about the state he was in. He sounded like a man who'd been sitting in a room by himself for a week, trying to put a puzzle together and kept finding that pieces were missing. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to listen completely before you say anything. Seraphine, I mean it, Lucien. Not one word until I'm done. A pause. Okay. Vivian is not acting alone. She has a handler. His name is Aldrich Sable. He runs a firm called Ardent Group out of Brussels, and his principal, the person he's ultimately working for, is a foreign syndicate that has been positioning for entry into the American market for at least 3 years. They used Vivian to get close to you. They used you. She paused, chose the words with precision. They used your specific weaknesses to engineer the banquet. The ring, the public act, all of it. It was designed to destabilize the alliance, isolate the families, create a vacuum, and then they were going to walk through. Silence on the line. Lucien. I heard you, he said. His voice was strange, flat in a way that wasn't calm. The flatness of a man processing something that was rearranging his understanding of the past year of his life. The banquet was engineered, yes. She told me. He stopped, started again. She told me it was what I already wanted. She made it seem like, she's very good, Seraphine said. That's what she was hired to be. Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality, harder, the anger coming up through the shock, and she could track the specific shift of a man moving from humiliation to fury in real time. What do you need from me? Nothing yet, she said. I need you to do exactly what you've been doing. Stay at the estate. Take Vivian's calls. Don't let on that anything has changed. You want me to? I need her to think that the situation is still what she believes it is, Seraphine said. The moment she knows I've identified Sable, she'll accelerate. We have a timeline, and I need it to hold. For how long? I don't know yet. Honest, because this was not a moment for managed information. Lucien, there's a complication. Someone photographed a meeting I held. Someone who was in the room, placed there before I knew about them. She paused. They know about the covenant. The silence that followed this was of a different character than any of the previous ones. It had depth to it. It had the specific quality of a silence that occurs when someone finally understands the full dimension of a mistake. My father, Lucien said quietly. He told me about the covenant. When I was young, he said it was... He stopped. He said it was the most important thing in the family, more important than the ring, more important than the territory. A pause. I didn't understand what he meant. I know. He was telling me about you, wasn't he? She didn't answer that directly. What I need you to understand is that if Sable moves against the Covenant, against me, before the Council of Shadows, everything we're working toward falls apart. The families lose the one mechanism that can legitimately restructure authority without triggering a war. And the foreign syndicate walks in. "Tell me what to do," Lucian said. Same words as before in her doorway. But the quality was different this time. Not the plaintive request of a man who wanted to be absolved, but something flatter and more deliberate. A man choosing to follow because he understood, for possibly the first time, that he had been following the wrong thing. "Stay in place," she said. "Stay close to Vivian. Don't change anything. If she asks about me, say nothing's changed. If Sable's people contact you directly—" She paused. "They won't. But if they do, you've never heard that name." "Okay." "And Lucien." She let a beat pass. "Don't trust anyone in your organization who you didn't know before Vivian arrived. Not yet." She hung up. The morning came gray and cold, and she was at Aldo's door in Flushing by 7:30. He lived alone, had for 20 years, in a house that was cluttered and warm and smelled like coffee, and something she'd never been able to identify, some particular combination of old paper and cleaning fluid, and something he cooked on Sundays. He opened the door before she knocked. He'd seen the car. And he took one look at her face and said, "Come in," in the tone of someone who already understood this was serious. She told him everything. Ash, Ardent Group, the photograph, the call to Lucian. She told him about Sable's principle. She laid out the theory now more fully than she had in Carroll Gardens, naming what she believed the foreign syndicate was and where it operated and what the American market represented to it. And she watched Aldo's face while she talked with the particular attention she always paid to him, because Aldo's face was one of the most honest instruments she knew, and what it showed her was not good. He didn't argue with any of it. That was the part that bothered her. He listened, and he nodded, and he didn't push back on a single premise, which meant he'd been running some version of this calculation himself and had arrived somewhere close to the same place. "The Council of Shadows," he said when she finished. 6 weeks. "You don't have 6 weeks," he said, "not if Sable knows what you're building toward." He was turning his coffee cup in his hands the way he did when he was working through something. "He'll move at the council, not before. He needs the optics of a legitimate claim, Vivian in the room with the ring, the families assembled. But he'll move at the council, and if he has people positioned inside it—" "I know," she said. "Then we're not preparing for the council anymore," Aldo said. "We're preparing for the council to be a trap." She looked at him. "We go in knowing it's a trap," she said, "and we use that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "That requires us to let it get bad enough in that room that every family present understands what they're actually looking at, before you invoke the covenant, because if you invoke it while they're still uncertain, it fails," she said. "Yes, I know." "That means letting Vivian believe she's won," Aldo said, "in front of everyone. Long enough for Sable's people to move, long enough for the foreign connection to become visible." He stopped. "Seraphine, that's—" "I know what that is," she said quietly. "People could get hurt." "I know." He looked at her for a long time. His face was doing the thing it did when he was weighing something he didn't want to weigh. "How certain are you about the covenant? That it holds, legally, within the families? That invoking it in that room works the way Dominic believed it would work?" She thought about this with more honesty than she'd allowed herself in previous weeks. 90%, she said finally. "What's the other 10? "The other 10 is that something in the document isn't as airtight as I think it is, or that one of the families in that room decides the moment is wrong and waits. She paused. "I've read it 100 times. I believe it holds, but I've never tested it." Aldo nodded slowly. "What do we do about Ash?" "Nothing," she said. "Not yet. We don't touch Ash. We don't change anything about how we're communicating, which means everything we discuss in person. Nothing by phone or message that didn't exist before. We let Ash report back to Sable what he sees, and what he sees is a woman who is proceeding on a compromise plan she doesn't know is compromised." "And the families," Aldo said, "the ones from Carroll Gardens. If they're compromised through Ash—" "They're not," she said. "Ash photographed the meeting. He heard the framework. He doesn't know the specifics because I haven't shared the specifics with anyone." She paused. "The document, the routing information, the legal foundation of the covenant." She touched the pocket of her coat. Habit, not necessity. The things she was describing weren't on her. "None of that went into that room." Aldo exhaled, long and slow. "All right," he said. "All right. What do you need me to do?" She told him. She spent the next 3 days moving differently, not in the ways anyone watching would notice, but internally, structurally, rethinking the approach from the point of the Carroll Gardens meeting forward. She sent a message to Elena Voss that read, on its surface, like a status update but contained a specific phrase that Elena, who had been briefed on a contact protocol during a meeting 2 years ago, that Seraphine had thought was precautionary, would understand as a signal to hold everything and wait for direct contact. She reached out to Cassia, who confirmed that the restructuring slowdown was holding, but that pressure was increasing, that Vivian's people were pushing harder in the past 48 hours than they had been before. That tracked. The failed assassination had rattled something. Not Vivian's nerve, but her timeline. She was accelerating. And then, on the 4th day after the photograph, 2 things happened within 6 hours of each other that changed the shape of everything. The first was a call from Doyle, who had been monitoring the federal investigation timeline, who said with the careful affect of someone delivering information they understand to be explosive. The DOJ contact that Harmon connected you with, the one described as sympathetic. A pause. He resigned this morning, no explanation given, effective immediately. She asked Doyle what that meant for the timeline. Doyle said, "It means the 6-week window just closed. The investigation is moving faster, and the person who is managing the pace of it from inside is gone." Another pause. Someone either scared him or bought him. Either way, you're now looking at 3 weeks, maybe less, before the federal timeline intersects with whatever you're building toward. 3 weeks, not 6. 3. She thanked Doyle and hung up. The second thing happened 4 hours later when Aldo called her and said, in a voice she'd never heard from him before, stripped of its characteristic steadiness, down to something raw, Ferrante. She heard it in the single word. What happened? "He had a heart attack this morning," Aldo said. "He's alive, he's in the hospital, but..." A pause. "Seraphine, he's not coming back to this. The doctors are saying weeks of recovery, maybe months. He's 78. His voice was tight. "He's out." Ferrante Lucio, the oldest capo, the one who had looked at her across the Carroll Gardens table and said the covenant in the voice of a man who had been keeping faith with something for a very long time, the one whose endorsement carried more institutional weight than anyone else's in that room, because his relationship with the founding generation was living memory, not history. Without Ferrante, the Council of Shadows presentation was weaker. Not broken, she told herself clearly, not broken, but weaker. And the 10% she'd acknowledged to Aldo just days ago felt like it had shifted. She was sitting in the Chelsea apartment, phone in her hand, doing the arithmetic of what she still had and what she'd just lost, when the third thing happened. A knock at the apartment door. She hadn't buzzed anyone up. The building had a secure entry, which meant either someone had followed her here, possible, given the past week, or someone in the building had let them through, which required a different kind of access entirely. She stood. She moved to the side of the door, not in front of it. She kept her voice flat when she said, "Who is it?" A voice she recognized. Not Lucian, not Aldo, not anyone from the Carroll Gardens meeting, a voice from further back, from the specific sealed compartment of her past that she thought she had closed permanently 12 years ago. "It's Marcus," the voice said. Marcus Ashcroft, her brother. She had not spoken to Marcus Ashcroft in 12 years. She had not spoken to him because the last conversation they'd had, in a hospital corridor in Philadelphia, 3 months after their mother's death, had ended with him telling her that she had chosen a world that would eventually consume her and that he wanted no part of it, and her telling him that she understood and respected that, and the two of them separating in a way that was not dramatic, not hateful, just final. She opened the door. He looked older, which was not surprising, and tired in a way that was not travel fatigue but something deeper and more chronic. He was 2 years younger than her, which put him at 37, but he looked close to 45. He was wearing a gray coat and carrying nothing, and his face, when she opened the door and they looked at each other for the first time in 12 years, held an expression she couldn't immediately read. Then she could read it. Fear. Specific directional fear, not the general anxiety of a man who was nervous. The controlled, forward-facing fear of someone who had been frightened by something real and had decided to do something about it. "You need to let me in," he said, "and you need to let me talk before you say anything." She stepped back from the door. He came in. He looked around the apartment without making a production of it, and then he turned to face her and he said, "I've been living in Brussels for 6 years." She went very still. "I work in private financial compliance," he said. "Cross-border transaction monitoring, anti-laundering framework. I know what I sound like saying that to you, given everything. I'm not here to argue about the irony." He stopped, swallowed. "3 weeks ago I came across a transaction set. Significant enough that I flagged it internally. Big enough to route through 3 separate jurisdictions and still leave a residue if you know where to look." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded set of papers, printouts, dense with numbers, the kind of thing that communicated its seriousness before you'd read a word. "I traced it back." He held the papers out to her. "It's connected to a firm called Ardent Group." She took the papers, she opened them, she read the first page. The transaction sets were dated across 14 months. The amounts were large enough to represent significant operational investment. The destination routing, on the third page, showed disbursements to 11 accounts across 4 countries. And 3 of the accounts, when she cross-referenced them against the architecture she carried in her memory, were connected to the Draven family's financial network. Not the visible network. Not anything Lucian would have authorized or known about. The deep infrastructure. The routing she had designed. Her routing. Someone had been siphoning from the network she'd built. Not large amounts, calibrated carefully to stay beneath the threshold of anything that would trigger a flag, but consistently, over 14 months, in a pattern that added up to somewhere between $60 and $80 million. She looked up from the papers. Marcus was watching her face. "You already know what Ardent Group is," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Then you know this isn't just an infiltration play," he said. "They're not coming in from the outside to take something. They've been inside your financial architecture for over a year." He paused. "Seraphine, someone gave them access to your specific networks, the ones nobody else would know about." She set the papers down on the desk. She thought about Dominic Draven in the Connecticut study. The night he'd shown her the Covenant. The night he'd told her everything about the Keeper of the Covenant and the Ashcroft bloodline and what he needed her to be. She thought about who else had been in that study. Who else had been there the night Dominic told her? The answer had only one name, and the name was one she had never, in 14 years of marriage, had reason to distrust. She picked up the encrypted phone with a hand that was completely steady, and she called a number she had used only twice in the past 14 years. And when it rang through to voicemail, she said, in a voice that was also completely steady, "I know what you did, and I know when you did it, and I need you to understand that the only way this ends without destroying everything that's left is if you come to me first." She hung up. She looked at her brother across the desk of the Chelsea apartment, and Marcus Ashcroft looked back at her with the exhausted, frightened face of a man who had crossed an ocean to deliver information that had cost him something. And she thought, the Covenant still holds. The families are still in reach. The council is still 6 weeks away, now 3. And the picture has changed completely, and I am standing in the wreckage of a plan I built carefully over 4 years, and discovering that someone was building a different plan inside it the entire time. She thought, I have to become something I have never needed to be before. She thought, I have to stop protecting and start destroying. The voicemail sat unanswered for 6 hours. Seraphine knew, because she checked. Not obsessively. Once every 40 minutes, with the disciplined regularity of someone monitoring a pressure gauge rather than waiting for a message from a person she'd trusted. The phone the call had gone to was one she'd used only twice, which meant only one person had the number, and that person's silence across 6 hours was itself a form of answer. Marcus had fallen asleep on the couch at 2 in the morning, still in his gray coat, with the particular sudden unconsciousness of someone who had been running on adrenaline for days and had finally reached a place they'd decided was safe enough to stop. She'd covered him with the spare blanket from the closet and gone back to the desk and worked until 4, going through the transaction documents he'd brought, cross-referencing them against the architecture she carried in her memory, with the meticulous attention of someone dismantling a structure they'd built themselves. The picture that emerged was surgical and patient and deeply intimate in the way that only sabotage by someone who truly understood your work could be. Whoever had given Ardent Group access hadn't given them a key. They'd given them a map, the specific granular knowledge of how the routing was structured, where the load-bearing points were, which connections were redundant and which were not. You could not have built this level of access from outside. You had to have been shown. There was only one person, besides Seraphine herself, who had been shown. At 4:15 in the morning, the phone rang. She picked up before the second ring. "I'm downstairs," Cassia said. Seraphine went still. "Cassia, I know what you think." Cassia's voice was steady, but carrying something underneath the steadiness. Not guilt, not exactly, but the specific weight of someone who had made a decision they understood the full cost of and were not trying to escape. "I need to explain it to you in person." "You should understand," Seraphine said, "that coming here was either very brave or very stupid." "I know which one it is," Cassia said. "Can I come up?" Seraphine looked at the wall for a moment, at Marcus asleep on the couch, at the transaction documents spread across the desk. "Come up," she said. Cassia looked like she hadn't slept, which was accurate, and like she'd been crying at some point in the past several hours, which was surprising. Cassia was one of the most internally disciplined people Seraphine had ever worked with, and in 8 years she had never seen anything cross her face that Cassia hadn't chosen to put there. She came in, and she didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the apartment and looked at Seraphine and said, "They have my daughter." The room was very quiet. "How long?" Seraphine said. "Since before the banquet." Cassia's jaw was tight. Her hands at her sides were absolutely still, which Seraphine recognized as the posture of someone holding themselves together through the specific discipline of not moving. "They came to me 8 weeks ago, Sable's people. They said—" She stopped, started again. "They said they knew about the networks. They said if I didn't give them access, they would take Mara." A breath. "They already knew where she lived. They already knew her schedule. They'd been watching her for months before they came to me." "Mara is in London," Seraphine said. "She was. They moved her, 3 days after the banquet. They moved her and they sent me a photograph so I'd know they were serious, and then they sent me another one last week." Cassia finally moved, reached into her bag, produced her phone, turned the screen towards Seraphine. A photograph of a young woman, mid-20s, in a room that looked like a safe house, holding a newspaper. Alive. Frightened. Alive. Seraphine looked at the photograph for 3 seconds and then looked at Cassia. "You gave them the routing architecture," she said. "Yes." "The specific access points?" "Yes." "Did you tell them about the covenant?" "No." Cassia's voice was absolutely certain on this. "I didn't know about the covenant until Carroll Gardens, and I was never in Carroll Gardens. Whatever they know about the covenant came from somewhere else." She held Seraphine's gaze. "I'm telling you this because I have nowhere else to go. Because the thing I was most afraid of was losing Mara, and I still am, but I am also watching what they're building with what I gave them, and I—" Her voice cracked once and then steadied. "I cannot let that be what I did." Seraphine did not comfort her, not because she didn't understand, she understood precisely, but because there was no time for comfort, and Cassia would know that, and wouldn't want it. "Where are they holding her?" Seraphine said. "I don't know the specific location. The photographs have been—" She stopped. "Wait." She went back into the bag. Produced the first photograph, the one from 3 days after the banquet. Handed it to Seraphine. "The newspaper in the first one. I looked at it, but I couldn't—" Seraphine looked at it. The newspaper was partially visible, folded to show the upper right corner of the front page. The masthead was not fully visible, but the typography was distinctive enough, and the corner of a photograph visible above the fold was distinctive enough, and the date format was distinctive enough that she could narrow it to one of 3 publications in a geographic range that included the greater Philadelphia area and parts of southern New Jersey. She handed the photograph back. "I know where to start," she said. She woke Marcus. He came awake fast, not the slow surfacing of someone interrupted from deep sleep, but the immediate alert awareness of someone whose nervous system had been on high caliber for weeks. He sat up and looked at Cassia without recognition, and then at Seraphine with a question he didn't ask. "I need you," she said to him, "to use your compliance access." He was quiet for a moment. "For what?" She told him. He didn't argue, which she appreciated. He asked 2 technical questions, received 2 answers, and said, "Give me an hour." While he worked, Seraphine called Aldo. It was 4:50 in the morning. He picked up on the first ring because Aldo had told her years ago that he slept with his phone on the pillow like a man who expected news at any hour, and she had never had reason to disbelieve him. "The source of the breach is Cassia," she said. "Coerced. They have her daughter." She didn't wait for his response. "I also know why the access was so specific. It wasn't a guess and it wasn't a hack. They mapped the architecture before they went to her, which means someone described it in enough detail for them to know what they were asking for." She paused. "The only other person who understood that architecture the way I do is someone I've been trying not to name for the past 3 hours." Aldo's breathing changed slightly on the line. "Who?" he said. "Dominic's lawyer," she said. "Hartley Reese." Silence. Hartley Reese had been Dominic Draven's personal attorney for 22 years. He had been in the Connecticut study the night Dominic showed Seraphine the covenant, not as a participant, as a witness, the way lawyers sometimes were to significant moments, standing near the door, not part of the conversation but present for it. She had not paid particular attention to him that night, because he was always there, a permanent fixture in the background of Dominic's professional life, and you stopped noticing permanent fixtures. He had retired 3 years ago, or what everyone had understood as retirement. "He knew about the architecture," she said. "Dominic consulted him on the legal structuring. He would have known enough to describe the framework to someone who wanted to understand it." A pause. "He was also the one who prepared the documents when Dominic set up the keeper provision. He knows about the covenant. He knows my role in it." "Seraphine," Aldo's voice was very careful, "if Reese is Sable's connection, then they've known about the covenant for at least 3 years," she said, "possibly longer. And the entire banquet sequence wasn't just about destabilizing the alliance. It was about drawing me out, making me invoke the covenant in a context they'd already prepared for." The silence that followed had a different texture from all the previous silences of this particular long night. It had the quality of 2 people simultaneously revising a picture they'd thought they understood and finding that the revision made the picture larger and more dangerous than before. "The Council of Shadows," Aldo said slowly. "If they've been preparing for you to invoke the covenant at the council, then they have something ready for it," Seraphine said. "A counter, a challenge, something that neutralizes it in the room, in front of every family, in the one moment when it needs to be unimpeachable." She paused. "Which means I can't invoke it the way I planned." "Then how?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I will, but not yet." She got off the phone. Marcus looked up from the laptop. He'd borrowed hers, connected through a secured tunnel she'd watched him establish, with the brisk efficiency of someone who did this routinely, and said, "Philadelphia. There's a property registered to a holding company that traces back 2 steps to an Ardent Group subsidiary. Residential. Outside the city, maybe 20 minutes." He turned the laptop toward her. "An address." She memorized it. She closed the laptop. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to go somewhere safe. Not here. Not anywhere connected to me. Seraphine, I need you alive and I need you accessible, and I need you somewhere they're not looking," she said. "Do you understand?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression she remembered from childhood, the specific look he got when he disagreed with her but recognized she was right. He'd had that look at 10 years old and apparently still had it at 37. "Where?" he said. She gave him a name and an address. A woman who ran a quiet bed and breakfast in Woodside, Queens, who had no connection to anyone in this story, who was simply someone Seraphine trusted in the flat, uncomplicated way you sometimes trusted people you'd known for a long time for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy. "Tell her I sent you," Seraphine said. "Don't use your phone once you leave here. Don't contact me. I'll reach you when it's over." He stood up. He put on his coat. He paused at the door and turned and said, "The documents I brought, they're evidence." "I know." "Federal-grade evidence." "I know, Marcus." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he left. She sent Cassia to a hotel in Midtown under a name that would hold for 72 hours, with a prepaid phone programmed with a single number, and told her to answer it when it rang and not before. Then she called Rennick. "I need the Philadelphia property addressed," she said. "Not by me." By someone Sable's people won't recognize. How clean. The girl comes out safe, Seraphine said. That's the only requirement. After that, I don't care how it looks. Rennick said, give me 6 hours. You have 4. A pause. 3 people. Whatever you need. She hung up. She looked at the clock. It was 5:40 in the morning, which put the Council of Shadows at just under 3 weeks away. And she had a dead federal contact, a compromised financial architect, a retired attorney who was Sable's inside man, a brother who'd crossed an ocean, a cracked rib that was making itself known every time she breathed too deeply, and a plan that no longer existed in the form she'd built it. She sat down at the desk. She opened the laptop and she started from the beginning. Not the Carroll Gardens beginning, not even the banquet beginning. She went back further, to the architecture, the financial network, the 17 routing paths she'd designed and memorized and maintained for a decade. She went back to the covenant and its provisions and its specific language, the language she'd memorized word for word and could recite in her sleep. She went back to Dominic Draven's study in Connecticut and stood there in her memory and looked at who was in the room and what was said and what was visible and what wasn't. And she built something new, not a plan she'd inherited or improved upon or defended, something she'd never needed before, built from the specific materials of this moment. A Cassia who was compromised but present, a Marcus who had federal compliance access, a Rennick who was currently driving toward Philadelphia, an Aldo who would do what she asked, an Elena Voss who had been told to hold and was holding, a Lucian Draven who was sitting in his own house next to the woman who'd been engineered to destroy him and who was, for possibly the first time in his life, doing exactly what he was told, and a Hartley Reese who believed his position was still hidden. That last one was the hinge. She called a number she had never used before, a number that had come from Judge Harmon 3 months ago, attached to the words sympathetic to structural arguments. The DOJ contact who had resigned. She called the number because resignation didn't mean unavailable, and because a man who'd been scared out of an official position still existed on the other side of it, and because she had something to offer him that his official position never could have. He picked up on the 4th ring. My name is Seraphine Ashcroft, she said. I have documentation of 14 months of cross-border financial transactions connecting a foreign syndicate to infiltration of the American Organized Crime Alliance. I have a source with compliance access who can verify chain of custody, and I have the name of the attorney who facilitated the arrangement on the domestic side. She paused. I'm not offering this to the department. I'm offering it to you personally because what I need in exchange is not prosecution, it's timing. Silence on the line. What kind of timing? He said. I need 3 weeks to hold, she said. I need nothing to move federally for 3 weeks. After that, you get everything. Every document, every routing record, every transaction trace, the whole architecture of what they built. She paused. And the name Hartley Reese attached to all of it, with sufficient documentation to make it stick. Another silence. Longer. You're asking me to sit on material evidence, he said. I'm asking you to let me do in 3 weeks what would take your office 3 years, she said. And I'm asking you to remember that you resigned this morning, which means you're not sitting on anything officially. You're a private citizen having a conversation. The silence that followed this was the silence of a man doing math. 3 weeks, he said. 20 days, she said. 19, after today. And then I get everything. Everything. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. She got off the phone at 6:20 in the morning and sat in the Chelsea apartment as the first gray light came through the windows and thought, all right, the architecture exists. Now she had to build it into something that would stand up in one room, in front of every family, in the moment when Sable's counter came. She needed to know what the counter was, which meant she needed Hartley Reese to show it to her without knowing that was what he was doing. She thought about it for a long time, working through it with the methodical patience that had always been her genuine instrument. Not the financial acumen, not the political relationships, but this, the willingness to sit with a problem long enough that it started to reveal its structure. Reese believed his position was hidden. He believed the only people who knew he'd been in that Connecticut study were Dominic, who was dead, and Seraphine, who he'd helped engineer into what he assumed was an untenable position. He believed she was operating on a compromised plan, running against a shortened timeline, isolated from her support structure. He believed the Covenant's invocation at the Council of Shadows was her play, and he believed they had a counter for it. She needed him to be comfortable enough to use the counter before the council, to show it to her in a context where she could see it without it being the real thing. She needed a rehearsal room. She picked up the encrypted phone and called Aldo. "I need a meeting," she said. "Not the Carroll Gardens room. Somewhere Reese knows about and will find out I'm using." "You want him to send someone?" Aldo said slowly. "I want him to feel safe enough to move," she said. "If he thinks the meeting is the real convergence, if he thinks I'm assembling the families before the council outside of the official venue, he'll try to counter it, and the counter will tell me what he has." A pause. "That's dangerous." "Yes." "Seraphine, if you're wrong about what the counter is, I've been wrong about several things in the past 2 weeks," she said. "I'm not wrong about Reese. I know how he thinks. I've sat across from that man for a decade." She paused. "Set the meeting. 3 days. Somewhere with visible entry points and a back that can be watched." Rennick called at 9:47 in the morning. "The girl is out," he said. "She's with one of my people. She's shaken, but she's not hurt." Seraphine exhaled once, slowly. "Good." "The property was running 2 people on site," Rennick said. "They're not going to be calling anyone." "Understood." "One of them talked before the end," Rennick said. "You want what he said?" "Yes." "The Council of Shadows venue has been changed," Rennick said. "Not officially. The families haven't been notified yet, but Sable's people have already been through the new location. The original venue was the Whitmore Club. They're shifting it to," and this is what he said, exact words, "the cathedral space on Dunmore Street." She knew the space. Everyone in that world knew it. An abandoned Catholic structure in Lower Manhattan that had been deconsecrated and sold 20 years ago and sat in a kind of institutional limbo since, privately owned, occasionally rented for events, used twice before in her memory for gatherings that required both space and the absence of official attention. The venue change made tactical sense. The Whitmore Club was known. It had entry and exit points that could be monitored, access that could be controlled, a neutral history. The Dunmore space was larger, darker, and had the specific advantage, from Sable's perspective, of being a location where your own people could be pre-positioned before anyone else arrived. They were planning to own the room before the room began. She called Aldo back. "Dunmore," she said. A silence. "How do you know?" "I know," she said. "The venue's been moved. Sable's people are already building position in it." A pause. "Which means we go in knowing they're there, and we build something they're not prepared for." "What does that look like?" Aldo said. "It looks like me walking into a room full of people who believe they've already won," she said, "and showing them something that can't be countered, not the way they're planning to counter it." "The covenant," he said, "but not invoked the way you'd planned." "No," she said, "different, faster. The moment the room is assembled, before Vivian makes her play, before Sable's people can move into position around it." She stopped. "I need to get there first. Not just earlier than them. First. And I need something in that room that wasn't in my original plan." "What?" "Proof that the counter exists," she said. "If I can show the families, in the moment, in that room, not just the covenant, but the active evidence of the attempt to subvert it, then the question of authority isn't a debate. It's a verdict." Aldo was quiet for a long time. "Reese," he said finally. "Reese," she agreed. "You're going to need him in the room." "Yes." "That means he has to believe right up until the moment he walks through that door that he's walking in to watch you fail." "That's exactly what it means," she said. The 3 days before the staged meeting were the most physically demanding of the entire sequence. She slept 4 hours a night, which was 2 fewer than she needed and 1 more than she allowed herself to acknowledge wanting. The cracked rib made itself present every morning, with the specific insistence of an injury that was being asked to accommodate more than it was designed to, and she addressed it with the over-the-counter painkillers and the deliberate, controlled breathing she'd been taught a long time ago, and that she now used the way you used any reliable tool, without sentiment, without gratitude, just functionally. She met with Elena Voss in person at a coffee shop in Brooklyn and spent 45 minutes transferring information. Not everything. She parceled it the way she always had, giving each person what they needed rather than what they wanted to know. But enough. Elena listened with the focused, Uninterrupted attention she brought to everything that mattered. And when Seraphine finished, she said, "The Dunmore space." "Yes. You need the Brennan family positioned before the official assembly. I need 3 Brennan people inside before Sable's advance team expects anyone. I need them inside, and I need them quiet, and I need them in the specific positions I'm going to give you." She slid a piece of paper across the table. Handwritten. Elena looked at it, folded it, put it away. "Theo Brennan has to agree personally," Seraphine said. "Not through a representative, directly." "I'll get you, Theo," Elena said, without inflection. She met with Daniel Ash. This was the part that required the most precision, because Ash didn't know she knew. And everything about this meeting had to look like a woman who was consolidating, tightening, pressing forward on a plan she believed in. And nothing about it could look like a woman who understood that the man across the table had photographed her in the Carroll Gardens room. She met him at a restaurant in Park Slope that she chose because it had a particular table configuration she needed, and she gave him exactly what she wanted Sable to have. A timeline that was accurate in its broad strokes and wrong in one specific, critical particular. The date of the full convergence. She moved it by 72 hours. Not a large displacement, but enough that if Sable positioned his counter around the date Ash reported, she would have 72 hours inside the Dunmore space before his preparation peaked. Ash was good. He gave nothing, asked the right questions, showed the right level of engagement, produced nothing in his face or his body that would have told a less practiced observer anything was wrong. She watched him with the specific attention she'd learned to bring to people who were very good at concealment. And what she saw was someone who was very good at concealment, which was exactly what she'd expected, and which told her that the information she'd given him would be reported back with high confidence. She thanked him for his time. She shook his hand. She watched him leave. Then she called Aldo and said, "The date he'll report is the 14th. We move on the 11th. 3 days earlier." "Yes." The staged meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in a private club in the West Village that Seraphine had used twice before in her career. Not for anything significant, which was why it was perfect for this. Visible enough that anyone monitoring her movements would register it as meaningful. Accessible enough that Reese's people could get eyes on it. Neutral enough that no one could read it as a final move. She was there for 20 minutes. She met with Aldo and Sal Benedetto and spoke about nothing that mattered while radiating the specific energy of someone in the final stages of preparation. She made sure she was seen arriving and leaving. She made sure the meeting had exactly the visible signature of a convergence that preceded a major action. Then she went back to the Chelsea apartment and waited. The response came the following morning, not from Reese directly, from a man named Toma, who Aldo had identified 3 days earlier as Reese's operational contact, the layer between the attorney and the people who did things, and who appeared at the apartment building at 7 in the morning and asked the doorman for Seraphine Ashcroft. She had anticipated this. She had briefed Cass, who was in the lobby. Cass sent the man up. He was 30, compact, with the careful blankness of someone hired specifically for his ability to present as unremarkable. He came in, and he didn't sit, and he said, without any particular preamble, "Mr. Reese would like to meet." "When?" she said. "Tonight." "Where?" He named an address she didn't know, which was the point, which meant they wanted to control the location. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to determine that she had no choice. And then she said, "Fine." He left. She called Rennick. She gave him the address. She gave him 3 hours to have eyes on it before she arrived. The location was a building in Red Hook. Not a dramatic choice, not somewhere with historical significance. Just a functional space that was private and had multiple exits and had been chosen by people who were practical about these things. She arrived at 8 in the evening, with Cass driving and Rennick at 2 of the building's access points, and the encrypted phone on her person and the Covenant. Not a copy, the original, or as close to an original as existed outside of the controlled document environment, in the fireproof document case in the car. She was going to need to make a decision tonight about whether to show Reese that she had it. She hadn't decided yet. Hartley Reese was 63 years old and looked exactly like what he was. A man who had spent his career in rooms with dangerous people and had survived by being useful. He was thin, silver-haired, precise in his movements and his dress. He was sitting at a table with a glass of water in front of him, and two men positioned near the far wall that Seraphine registered and categorized in the 2 seconds before she crossed the room to sit across from him. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is not surprised. "Seraphine," he said. "Hartley," she said. "You know why I wanted to meet." "No," she said honestly. "I know what you've done. I don't know why you wanted to meet about it now." Something moved across his face. "What I've done," he said carefully. Ardent Group. 14 months of access to the routing architecture. The documents Marcus brought from Brussels, which are currently in a location you don't know. She held his gaze. "And the banquet. Whatever role you played in the engineering of it." The silence lasted several seconds. "I was Dominic's attorney for 22 years, Reese said at last. "I know. Do you know what that meant? What that actually cost?" His voice was even, but there was something moving underneath it. Not guilt, but a very old grievance that had finally been given permission to speak. "I managed every aspect of that family's legal exposure, every deal, every arrangement, every document that required a signature. I kept Dominic out of federal custody twice in 8 years. And when he died," he stopped. "When he died, Lucien kept me on for 6 months, and then told me my services were no longer required." A pause. "In an email." She watched him. "And then I found out," Reese said, "what Dominic had actually left behind. What he'd given to you." His eyes moved to her face with something that had been cleaned of its original emotion and distilled into something harder. "The covenant. The keeper provision. He gave it to a woman he'd known for 2 years who hadn't done anything yet, who was 24 years old. And I had given him 22. He paused. "I was the one who drafted those provisions. I wrote the language. I understood what it was. And he looked right past me." She held his gaze. "So when Sable's people came to me," he said, "I wasn't difficult to convince." "No," she said. "I imagine you weren't." He leaned forward slightly. "The Council of Shadows is 12 days away. You know Vivian is going to walk in with the ring and make her claim, and you know you were planning to counter it with the Covenant, and you should also know that we've prepared for exactly that." He paused. "I drafted the counter provision myself. It challenges the validity of the Keeper designation on procedural grounds. The original Covenant contains a ratification requirement that was never formally executed because Dominic didn't have time before he died. Without that ratification, the Keeper designation is ceremonial, not binding." A small, controlled pause. "Which means, in that room, in front of every family, when you produce the Covenant, I stand up and I tell them what it's missing." The room was very quiet. Seraphine looked at Hartley Reese and felt the full weight of what he'd just told her. Not because she hadn't expected a counter, she had. But not this one. Not the ratification provision. Because he was right. She'd read the document 100 times, and the ratification clause was in it, and it had not been executed. And she had known this for years and had categorized it as a technicality because Dominic had told her the provision had been understood as self-ratifying by the original families. But Dominic was dead, and the family's understanding of what he'd believed was not the same as a signed document. She sat across from Hartley Reese and she felt, for the first time in this entire sequence, the specific sensation of a wall she had not known was there. Then she breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. And she thought, ratification. She looked at Reese and something shifted in her face that she didn't try to hide, because the thing that shifted was not defeat, and he needed to read it as defeat long enough for her to leave this room. "You drafted it yourself," she said. "Yes." "And Sable has the legal argument prepared." "It's airtight," he said. "I made sure of it." She nodded slowly, as if absorbing a blow. She let her shoulders carry some of the weight of it. She let her eyes move away from his, not in weakness, but in the specific pattern of someone recalculating a position they believed was solid and finding it isn't. She was performing, but only partially, because the ratification clause was real, and the gap it represented was real, and what she was recalculating was not whether she could survive this. It was how. She stood up. "Thank you for meeting with me, Hartley." He looked at her with the cautious expression of a man who had expected a different reaction. "That's all." "That's all," she confirmed. She walked out of the building into the cold night air and got into the car and sat in the back seat in silence for 60 seconds while Cass drove away from the building, and then she said, "Drive. Just drive for a while." She sat in the moving car and thought about the ratification clause. Original signatories, 7 families, 1947. The ratification provision required endorsement from a representative of each founding family that the keeper designation was legitimate and binding. It was a safeguard against unilateral claims, written into the document by men who understood that in their world, unilateral claims were the beginning of wars. Dominic had believed the understanding was sufficient. He had told her so explicitly, had said the provision was understood as executed in spirit by the families who had honored it. But understanding and execution were different things. She thought about who was still alive. Who in the room at the Council of Shadows had lineage that connected to the founding families. Not leaders, lineage. The original 7 families were not the same as the 5 families who currently held power. Some had merged, some had been absorbed, some had simply ended. But the bloodlines didn't end the way organizations ended. They continued in quieter directions. She pulled out the encrypted phone. She called Aldo. "I need you to find something for me," she said. "Before the 11th, I need the names of anyone alive today who has blood connection to any of the original 7 founding families of the 1947 Covenant. Not the organizations, the people." She paused. "Because if the ratification can be challenged for not being executed, it can also be executed now, in the room, by the people with the standing to do it." Aldo was quiet for a moment. "You're going to ratify it live," he said, "in the room. In front of everyone," she said, "before Reese can make his argument. With the people who have the standing to make it valid standing up in that room and doing it." She paused. "Which means the counter provision he spent months preparing becomes irrelevant the moment it's invoked, because the thing it was designed to challenge will have already been remedied." "Seraphine." Aldo's voice had something in it she didn't hear often. "If you can pull this off, I need the names first," she said. "Then we'll talk about pulling it off." She put the phone down. 11 days until the Council of Shadows. 11 days to find the bloodlines, build the ratification, and walk into a room full of people who believed she was already finished, including a man who had spent 2 decades building toward this moment, and a woman wearing a ring that had always been a symbol, and somewhere behind both of them, a foreign syndicate that had spent 3 years engineering the collapse of something it wanted to walk into. 11 days. She looked at the city moving past the window of the car, and she thought about Dominic Draven in the Connecticut study, and she thought about a 24-year-old woman who hadn't yet known who she was, and she thought about what it cost to become the person that woman had become. Then she thought, enough looking back. She picked up the phone again, and she started making calls, and the city moved around her in the dark, indifferent and enormous, and entirely unaware that somewhere inside it, the final act was already beginning. Aldo found 4 names. He called her on the morning of the 8th day before the council, while she was sitting at the Chelsea desk with 3 cups of cold coffee and a legal pad covered in handwriting that had gotten progressively smaller as the night went on, the way her handwriting always did when she was thinking harder than she was writing. He read the names slowly, one at a time, with the pauses of a man who understood the weight of each one. She wrote them down. She looked at the list. 2 of the names she knew. One she'd met, briefly, at a function 8 years ago. A woman in her 60s named Dorothea Crane, who had no visible connection to organized crime and ran a small auction house in the West Village, and whose grandmother had been the representative of the Crane family at the 1947 signing. The second was a man named Gus Ferrero, who was Rafael Okafor's accountant and who, Aldo told her quietly, had bloodline connection to one of the original founding families through a maternal line that had changed its name twice since the 40s. The third name was Sal Benedetto, who was already in her circle and who had never mentioned, in 20 years of operating within the Draven organization, that his grandfather had signed the original covenant as the Benedetto family representative. She thought about this for a moment and understood. Of course, he hadn't mentioned it. In a world where institutional memory was power, you kept your deepest cards face down until the moment they were needed. The 4th name stopped her completely. Vivienne Moreau. She read it twice. She called Aldo back. "Tell me," she said. "It took me longer to find because the line is maternal, and it goes through a name change in 1962, Aldo said, with the careful, measured delivery of someone who had been sitting with this information long enough to have processed his own reaction to it. Vivienne Moreau's mother was born Isabelle Fontaine. Isabelle Fontaine's mother was Claire Fontaine, née Deschamps. A pause. Claire Deschamps was the daughter of the Deschamps family representative who signed the original covenant. Seraphine held the phone and looked at the wall. She doesn't know, Aldo said. I'm reasonably certain she doesn't know. The Deschamps line was cut from the alliance records after a dispute in 1959. The family was effectively erased from the official history. There would be no reason for anyone to have told her. Another pause. But it's there. The bloodline is there. She thought about Vivienne Moreau. She thought about a woman who had been positioned, shaped, deployed as a mechanism, who had walked into Lucien Draven's life not because she chose it, but because someone had identified her usefulness and engineered the approach. She thought about Aldrich Sable, who had built a 3-year operation with Vivienne as its most visible component, and she thought about whether Sable had known about the Deschamps bloodline and used it, or whether it was simply coincidence. She didn't believe in coincidence at this scale, which meant Sable had known, had specifically chosen Vivienne because of it, had positioned her inside the Draven family not just as a face for the takeover, but as an insurance policy against exactly the kind of move Seraphine was now planning. If anyone challenged Vivienne's authority using the covenant, Sable could produce her bloodline as a counter, a claim that Vivienne herself had legitimate standing under the founding documents. He'd thought of everything, except that Seraphine was the one who'd found it first. She sat very still for a long time, working through what this meant, and what it changed, and what it opened. And then, slowly, she began to see the shape of something she hadn't been able to see before. Not a workaround, not a defensive maneuver, but a move that made everything she'd been building larger than she'd intended it to be. She thought, Vivienne doesn't know what she carries. She thought, that is not Vivienne's fault. She picked up the phone and she made the call she had spent 9 days telling herself she didn't need to make. Vivienne answered on the 3rd ring. The silence between the hello and Seraphine speaking was approximately 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds Seraphine could hear the specific quality of a woman recalibrating very fast. Surprised, wary, not showing the surprise or the wariness, performing steadiness. Vivienne was, whatever else she was, genuinely good at performance. Seraphine, she said, neutral, careful. I need to meet with you, Seraphine said, not as adversaries, as women who have both been used by the same man. A pause. Sable. Yes. Another pause, longer. The sound of a woman doing real calculation in real time, which Seraphine respected in its way. When? Vivienne said. Tomorrow morning. Somewhere you choose. Bring whoever you need to feel safe. The meeting happened in a hotel restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place that was expensive enough to ensure privacy and public enough to make violence impractical. Vivienne came with one man, positioned 2 tables away, who had the bearing of someone who'd done protective work for a long time. Seraphine came alone, which she understood would be read as either confidence or recklessness, and was comfortable with either interpretation. Vivienne in person, across a breakfast table, without the staging of the ballroom or the adversarial framing of the past weeks, was different from Seraphine's accumulated image of her. She was younger looking than she appeared in the context of power, not in years but in something less definable, a quality of someone who had learned to present older, more settled, more certain, because the environment required it. She was wearing the dawn ring. She didn't take it off during the conversation, and Seraphine didn't comment on it. He told me, Vivienne said, without any preamble, after the coffee came, that I had a genuine claim, that the Draven family's authority had been mismanaged, and that there was a legitimate case for restructuring the leadership. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. He made it sound like something I'd earned, something I had a right to. He needed you to believe that, Seraphine said. I know that now. Her jaw tightened. I've known it for about 2 weeks, since the Petrov shooting. She looked across the table. I didn't order that. I know, Seraphine said. Sable did. To demonstrate what happens when someone in the organization doesn't comply. Vivienne's eyes moved away for a moment, then back. He's been managing my access to Lucien, she said. Filtering what I see and hear, I thought I was in control of something. A short, hard exhale. I was in a different kind of cage. Seraphine looked at her steadily. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, she said, and I need you to hear all of it before you react. She told Vivienne about the Deschamps bloodline. She told it without embellishment and without strategy, just the facts in the order she'd found them, because Vivienne had the right to receive this information cleanly and without manipulation. She watched Vivian's face while she talked, watched the sequence of things that moved through it. Disbelief, then the specific, uncomfortable recognition of something that was restructuring your understanding of your own life, then something that was not quite grief, but lived in the same house. He knew, Vivian said when Seraphine finished. Yes. He positioned me because of it. Yes. Vivian looked down at the ring on her hand. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said quietly, "What do you need?" "I need you to be in that room," Seraphine said, "at the council, and I need you to understand what's going to happen and choose it freely. Not because I've told you to, not because Sable has positioned you for it." She paused. "Because you decide that this is what you want to do with what you carry." Vivian looked up. Her eyes were dry and very direct. "And if I do this, if I stand in that room and do what you're describing, what happens to me after?" Seraphine considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "You're not a Dawn," she said. "You never were. The families won't accept you as one, and I won't pretend otherwise, but the Deschamps bloodline is yours, and I can establish it as part of the record. And what that means for your standing in this world going forward is something we can negotiate in good faith after." She held her gaze. "You have legitimate standing, Vivian. Sable used it without your knowledge. That's a wrong that has a remedy." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "All right," she said. The 7 days that followed were the most precisely constructed of the entire operation. Every conversation happened in person. Every piece of positioning was timed to a schedule that only she and Aldo and Rennick held in complete form, with each other participant knowing only their own piece. She met with Dorothea Crane at the auction house in the West Village and explained in 40 minutes what she needed and why. Dorothea listened with the focused attention of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and knew exactly how to use that. She said yes without deliberating. She met with Gus Ferrero through Rafael Okafor, who had been told enough, not everything, but enough, to understand what he was authorizing. And Ferrero, a quiet man in his 50s with the careful precision of someone who had spent a career making numbers behave, looked at the covenant's ratification clause and said, "My grandfather signed this." "Yes," Seraphine said. "Then I have standing." "Yes." "All right." Sal Benedetto, when she called him, said simply, "I've been waiting for someone to ask." The 11th day. 3 days ahead of the date, Ash had reported to Sable. The Dunmore space on a Tuesday night, November, the city outside indifferent and cold, the building itself dark from the street in a way that meant nothing, because the darkness was deliberate. She arrived at 9:17 in the evening, 2 hours before any of the families were expected, because she needed the room and she needed to walk it. Rennick had been in and out of the building 3 times over the past 4 days, and what he'd found was a pre-positioned structure. Sable's people had placed themselves in the building, mostly in the upper level, in positions that gave sight lines over the main floor. Not assassination positions, control positions, places from which you could manage a room. She had dealt with this by having Aldo and Sal Benedetto's people come through the building the night before through access Rennick had prepared, occupying positions above Sable's positions. Not to neutralize them immediately, to hold them. To ensure that when the moment came, the room's control structure was not what Sable believed it was. She stood in the center of the main floor of the Dunmore space and looked up at the vaulted ceiling, at the dark upper level, at the columns and the long windows that let in the dull orange of the city's night sky. It was a large room that had once been something else and was now simply itself, a space that didn't mean anything except what people brought to it. She thought about what she was about to ask this room to hold. Then she opened the fireproof document case, and she removed the covenant. The original was handled in a specific way. Not fragile, it had been well preserved, but with the care that you bring to things that have consequence beyond their physical existence. She unfolded it on the table that had been set up at the south end of the room. She looked at the signatures at the bottom of the last page. 7 names, in 7 different hands, with a date and a notarial seal that had faded to near invisibility. She found the Deschamps signature. She found the Benedetto. She found the Crane. She found the Ferrero family name. Different spelling then, but there. She was still looking at it when Lucien arrived. He came alone, which surprised her, and then didn't surprise her, because Lucien Draven alone was something she understood, and Lucien Draven with soldiers behind him was a statement she'd told him not to make tonight. He was wearing a dark coat, and he looked like a man who had been living with a specific weight for several weeks and had stopped trying to put it down. He looked at the covenant on the table. He didn't touch it. "How many people in the room by the time Vivienne arrives?" he said. "Enough," she said. "She'll have Sable's people with her." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the covenant again with the expression of a man encountering his father in a document. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "When my father told you about this," he said, "when he showed it to you, did you know even then that it was going to come to this?" She thought about being 24 in a Connecticut study, about what she'd known and what she'd guessed and what she couldn't have imagined. "No," she said honestly. "I knew what I was being entrusted with. I didn't know what it would cost." He nodded slowly. His jaw moved. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the banquet, for all of it." She looked at him. The apology was real. She could read Lucian well enough to know the difference between a real apology and a strategic one. And this was real in the uncomfortable, unpolished way of something that didn't have anywhere to go once it was said. "I know," she said. "That's not forgiveness," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." He seemed to accept that. He moved to a position near the west wall, where Aldo had told him to stand, and he stood there and waited, and the room began to fill. They came the way these people always came to things that mattered, carefully, with awareness of who else was arriving and in what order, reading the room before they committed to it. The Castellano representative, then Brennan's people, with Elena Voss at the front. Raphael Okafor came in person, which Seraphine had not expected, and which meant he'd decided that this was worth his physical presence, which was the most significant endorsement she'd received since the whole thing began. Dorothea Crane came quietly and stood near the south wall near the document table. Ferrero positioned himself without being directed because he understood instinctively where he needed to be. Daniel Ashe arrived with the Okafor group. He looked at the room, at the configuration of it, at who was present, at the date, and she watched his face register the arithmetic. 3 days early, not the 14th, the 11th. She could see the precise moment he understood that the timeline he'd reported was wrong, and she could see him making the calculation about whether to do something with that understanding or hold position. He held position, which told her something useful about him, that he was a professional first, which meant in the next hour, if the room went the way she intended, he would make a professional's decision about which side of it to be on. Vivienne arrived at 11:10. She came with 3 people, 2 of them Sable's, 1 of them her own, and she entered the Dunmore space with the practiced composure of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this room. She was wearing the dawn ring. She walked to the center of the floor and she looked around at the assembled families, and she looked at Seraphine across the room, and what passed between them in that 3-second exchange was not visible to anyone else, and did not need to be. Sable arrived 2 minutes later. He was not what she'd imagined, which was always true of people you'd built an image of from documentary evidence. He was tall, mid-50s, with a kind of contained physical presence that didn't announce itself. He took in the room the way a man took in a space he believed he'd already won, which was with a specific quality of settled confidence that hadn't yet met a reason to become something else. His eyes found Seraphine. He studied her for a moment. She held the look without expression. Then he looked at the document table, at the covenant. Something changed in his face. Not much, just a micro shift of calculation, the look of a man updating an assessment. The room settled into itself. The particular quality of silence that came when every person present understood that something significant was about to happen and had agreed, tacitly, to let it. Vivienne spoke first. She addressed the room the way she'd been prepared to address it, clearly, with the particular authority of someone who had rehearsed this moment and believed in their right to it. She spoke about the Dawn Ring and what it represented, about the Draven family's authority and its natural extension to the assembled families, about the new era she intended to represent. She spoke well. She had been given excellent material, and she delivered it without stumbling. When she finished, the room was quiet. Seraphine let the quiet hold for 3 seconds. Then she spoke. "The Dawn Ring," she said, "was always ceremonial." The room's quality of attention shifted. She felt it change, the specific rotation of focus that happened when a room understood that something was being said that had more under it than what was audible. She walked to the document table. She picked up the covenant, carefully, both hands, the way you carried something that had weight beyond its physical mass. And she turned to face the assembled families. She explained what it was. Not quickly, slowly, with the precision of someone who understood that the next several minutes were the document's entire justification for existing. She read the relevant passages aloud. She explained the keeper provision in language that was plain and direct and unmistakable. She explained her bloodline and its connection to the Ashcroft name in the founding records. And she said, clearly, I am the keeper of the covenant. I have held this document for 14 years, at the request of Dominic Draven, in trust for the alliance it represents. Hartley Reese stepped forward. He did it smoothly, with the practiced movement of a man who had been waiting for his cue. He addressed the room with the confidence of someone who had prepared this moment over months, and he laid out the ratification argument in the precise, well-organized language of a man who had once been very good at his profession. The room listened. The room was very quiet. When he finished, Seraphine said, "You're right." Reese paused, looked at her. "The ratification provision exists," she said, "and it was not formally executed at the time of Dominic Draven's death." She let this sit for 2 seconds. "Which is why we're going to execute it now." She looked at Sal Benedetto. Sal stepped forward. He was 64 years old and had been in this world for 40 years, and he moved through the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who had finally arrived at the moment he'd been holding space for. He came to the table and he looked at the covenant and he said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "My grandfather's name is in this document. I carry his name. I ratify the keeper designation as valid and binding." Dorothea Crane stepped forward from the south wall. She was elegant and unhurried, and she came to the table and looked at the document and said, "My grandmother's name is in this document. I carry her line. I ratify the keeper designation as valid and binding." Gus Ferrero stepped forward, quiet, precise, without ceremony. He looked at the document. "My family's name is in this document, under a spelling we no longer use. The bloodline is unbroken. I ratify the keeper designation as valid and binding." 3 ratifications. The founding document required a majority of the original 7 family lines to ratify. 3 of 7 was not a majority. Reese knew this. She could see him doing the math, could see the recalibration running behind his eyes, could see him understanding that she'd known about the ratification requirement and had prepared for it, and that 3 was not enough, and that she knew 3 was not enough. She turned to look at Vivian. The room followed her gaze. Vivian stood in the center of the floor. The dawn ring was on her hand. The room was looking at her with the complete, focused attention of people who understood that something was happening that they had not anticipated. Seraphine said nothing. She didn't ask. She didn't instruct. She had told Vivian in that hotel restaurant that she needed her to choose freely, and that was the only thing she could offer, and it had to be enough. Vivian looked at the covenant on the table. She looked at Seraphine. She looked at the dawn ring on her hand. She took the ring off. She set it on the table beside the covenant, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just setting it down. And she walked to the table and she looked at the document and she said, "The Deschamps name is in this document. That line runs through my mother's mother. I didn't know that when I came into this room." A pause. "I know it now." She looked up at the assembled families and her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they've accepted their own cost. "I ratify the keeper designation as valid and binding." 4. A majority. The room was absolutely silent. Sable moved. Not toward Seraphine, toward the upper level, a signal, the quick decisive movement of a man executing a contingency. And from the upper level, nothing happened. No response, no movement, because all those people were already there. Sable turned back to the room. He looked at the positions, the configuration, the faces. He was processing, very rapidly, the realization that every element he'd prepared had been anticipated and superseded. It took him approximately 4 seconds to complete this assessment. Then he looked at Seraphine. "The transactions," he said quietly. Not to the room, to her specifically. "The documentation your brother brought. Whatever you have, it won't survive a legal challenge. Ardent Group's structure is... The documentation is already with the Department of Justice," she said. "Chain of custody verified. Your company's connection to the transaction sets is documented across 14 months. She paused. "And Hartley Reese's name is attached to all of it. with the specific legal work he did to facilitate the domestic side of the arrangement. She looked at Reese. I think you both have a significant amount to think about in the next few hours. Reese's face was the color of old concrete. Sable said nothing more. He understood, with the specific comprehension of a very intelligent man who had lost, that there was nothing productive to say. What happened next took 3 hours, and was not dramatic in the way that the preceding minutes had been dramatic. It was administrative, the particular grinding work of a room full of people who had just witnessed a power structure shift and now had to decide what they were going to do with that. There were conversations, some heated, some not. There were questions about the covenant's provisions that she answered with the precision of someone who had memorized every word. There were questions about what the keeper designation meant in practical terms, for each family's existing arrangements, for the structure of the alliance going forward. She answered all of it, patiently, completely, without hedging. Sable and Reese were separated from the assembly early in the process, not arrested, not harmed, simply held in a side room under the watch of people who had been briefed on what to do with them. And the room proceeded without them. Lucien spoke once, near the end. He addressed the assembled families briefly, from his position near the west wall, and he said something Seraphine had not expected and had not prepared for. He said that the banquet had been his failure, that the recklessness that had triggered this sequence had been entirely his own, that the woman who had held the alliance together for 14 years without credit or acknowledgement deserved the recognition that this room was now giving her, and that he was removing himself from the Dawn seat of the Draven family, effective immediately, and placing its affairs under the temporary stewardship of his senior capos pending a formal restructuring under Seraphine's oversight. He said all of this without looking at Seraphine. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Mario Castellano, who had said almost nothing for the entire preceding 3 hours, stood up. He was a heavy man in his late 60s with the particular bearing of someone who had seen everything and had learned to make his opinions known through the economy of gesture rather than the expenditure of words. He looked around the room. He looked at Seraphine. He nodded. One nod, slow, deliberate. And that was the thing that did it. Not the covenant, not the ratification, not the 3 hours of procedural wait. That single nod from Mario Castellano, which was the most Mario Castellano had done in the room all evening, and which every person present understood as a complete and unambiguous statement of position. The Castellanos were in. After that, it moved the way things move when the center of gravity has shifted and everyone can feel it. The Dunmore space cleared out slowly, in the particular way of events that have been significant. People leaving in pairs and small groups, speaking quietly, with the subdued manner of those who had witnessed something they would be processing for a long time. By 2 in the morning, the room was nearly empty. Rennick handled Sable and Reese's departure. She didn't ask the specifics of how. She had given him the documentation, the federal contact's number, and the instruction that both men needed to be in a position to answer questions in an official context within 48 hours, and she trusted him to arrange that without her needing to know the mechanics. Daniel Ash found her near the document table as the room was emptying. He stood in front of her with the specific expression of someone who had made a professional calculation and intended to be honest about it. "You knew I was Sable's source," he said. "Yes." "Since when?" "The photograph of the Carroll Gardens meeting," she said. "I found out about your history with Ardent Group 4 days later." He absorbed this. "The information I gave him, the timeline, was wrong," she said. "By design." He was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Okafor doesn't know," he said. "No. He'll need to know." "Yes," she said. "He will." Ash nodded slowly. There was something in his face that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite relief, but lived somewhere in the complicated territory between them. "What happens now?" he said. "That's between you and Raphael," she said. "I'm not going to make that decision for either of you." He left. Vivienne was the last to go, besides Seraphine herself. She was standing near the door with her coat on, and the dawn ring no longer on her hand. It was still on the table, where she'd set it, and it sat there in the low light of the emptying room, looking exactly like what it was, a piece of gold with a crest on it. "What you said in the restaurant," Vivienne said, "about the Deschamps bloodline and what it means for my standing, did you mean that?" "Yes," Seraphine said. "What does it actually mean, practically?" Seraphine thought about this honestly. It means you have standing in the history of this alliance that is legitimate and documented and not dependent on anyone else's authorization. What you do with that is your choice. She paused. You were used. That's true. It's also true that you made choices. You walked into that ballroom. You wore that ring. She held Vivian's gaze without apology and without cruelty. Those things happened. The question now is what comes next. Vivian looked at the ring on the table. I don't want it, she said. I know. I don't want any of it. The family, the territory, any of it. Her voice was flat in the way of someone who has burned through the version of themselves that wanted something and is now standing in what remains. I want to know who I am without all of this. That, Seraphine said, is something I can't help you with. Vivian looked at her for a moment, and something moved across her face. Not warmth exactly, but the specific recognition that passes between two people who have faced the same room from opposite sides and both survived it. She nodded once, then she left. The Dunmore space was empty. Seraphine stood at the document table alone. She folded the covenant carefully, the way it had been folded when she first received it, and she returned it to the fireproof case, and she closed the clasp. She picked up the dawn ring and held it in her hand for a moment. It was heavier than she'd expected. She'd seen it on Lucian's hand for 9 years and somehow had never registered its actual weight until now. She set it back on the table. She left it there. She found Lucien outside, standing on the sidewalk in the cold, his breath making small clouds in the November air. He was looking at the street the way you look at something when you're not really seeing it. The particular unfocused gaze of a man whose mind is somewhere else entirely. She stood beside him for a moment without speaking. The estate, he said finally. The Long Island property. It's in my name. I know. I'd like to keep it, he said. Not as a base of operations, just... He stopped. Just to have a place. She thought about this. About Lucian Draven, who had been the most feared man in New York for 9 years, standing on a sidewalk in Lower Manhattan at 2 a.m. asking if he could keep his house. That's not my decision, she said. The estate is yours. What you do with your private life isn't something I'm going to manage. The exile, he said. You're serious about that. You can't operate in this world anymore, she said. Not as a principal. Not in any capacity that touches the alliance. That's the condition. She paused. It's not punishment, Lucien. It's the consequence of what you broke. She looked at the street. You broke a lot of things. Some of them can be repaired. Some can't. Which ones can't, he said. She didn't answer that. She thought he knew the answer without needing to hear it. He turned and looked at her with the face of a man who had arrived, possibly for the first time, at the actual edges of himself. The place where what you thought you were and what you actually were became the same territory. He looked older than he was, and tired in a way that wasn't physical. I loved you, he said. I know that's not... I know what it's worth right now, but I need you to know that it was real. I know it was real, she said. Was it enough? She looked at him. She thought about 14 years. She thought about what real meant and what enough meant, and what the gap between those two things had cost both of them. No, she said, gently, honestly. It wasn't. He absorbed that. He didn't argue. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man accepting the last word of something. Then he turned and walked to his car, and she watched him go. And when the car pulled into traffic and disappeared, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold and thought, that's done. She called Marcus from the car on the way back to Chelsea. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been waiting. She told him it was over, that both Sable and Reese were being handled, that the documentation he'd brought was where it needed to be. I was quiet for a moment after she finished, and then he said, in the voice of a man who is choosing the shorter version of something longer, You okay? I don't know yet, she said. That's honest. I'm working on honest, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived near one. When do I get to come back to regular life? Tomorrow, she said. Come for coffee. You have coffee at that apartment? I'll get some. He said goodnight and hung up, and she rode the rest of the way to Chelsea in silence, watching the city out the window the way you watch something familiar after a long time away, recognizing it, letting it register, allowing yourself to be in the same space as it without having to do anything about it. The Chelsea apartment at 3 in the morning was quiet in the specific way of a place that had absorbed a great deal of activity and was now at rest. She sat at the desk, not to work, just to sit. In the chair she'd sat in for 11 days of planning and calling and building something she hadn't been certain would hold. She thought about the covenant in the fireproof case, about the 4 names that had stepped forward in that room, about a room full of dangerous people who had, in the end, recognized the thing that was real. She thought about Dominic Draven, about what he'd known and what he'd asked her to be, about whether he'd understood, at the end, what it would actually cost. She thought he had. She thought that was why he'd asked her specifically, and not someone else. Not because she was exceptional, she'd spent 14 years being careful not to believe she was exceptional, but because she was the person who would pay the cost without requiring it to mean something it didn't mean, without needing it to be a story about herself. The coffee was cold on the desk. She drank it anyway. At some point, she became aware that the light outside the window had changed, the particular blue-gray of a city morning beginning to separate itself from night. She looked at it for a while. Manhattan doing what Manhattan always did, which was proceed without waiting for anyone to finish what they were doing. She thought about what came next, the actual work of it, the restructuring, the conversations, the documentation that needed to be filed, and the arrangements that needed to be renegotiated, and the very long process of converting what had happened last night into something that functioned. It was not going to be clean. It was not going to be fast. The surviving families would test her, individually and collectively, because that was what they did and what she would do in their position. There would be challenges she hadn't anticipated and mistakes she hadn't yet made, and 100 smaller versions of what she'd just come through, stretched out over years. She knew this. She'd always known this. It was not a comforting knowledge, and she didn't ask it to be. She got up from the desk. She went to the window and she stood in front of it and looked at the city coming into morning. The buildings going from silhouette to detail, the light catching the east-facing windows of the buildings across from her, the street below with its early traffic and its specific sound. She thought about Dominic's words, the last time she'd been in that Connecticut study, the last time she'd seen him before he died. He'd looked at her across his desk with the eyes of a man who was tired in the deep, irrevocable way of someone who had been holding something up for a very long time and could feel it in everything. He'd said, "It's going to fall to you. I've always known it would. I just didn't know when." She'd asked him what he was afraid of. He'd been quiet for a long time. Then he'd said, "That you'll lose something you can't get back." She stood at the window and thought about what she'd lost. She made herself be honest about it. Not the list that served a narrative, but the actual list. 14 years. The particular kind of intimacy that comes from being the person who understands everything about someone's world, even when they don't understand yours. The version of herself that had believed, in some compartment she'd kept sealed, that the arrangement she'd made could eventually become something else. She'd lost those things. They were gone. She understood that. She also understood, standing at the window in the first light of a Wednesday morning with cold coffee and a healing rib and 11 days of accumulated exhaustion in her bones, that what remained was not nothing. It was something she didn't have a clean word for. Not triumph, which implied ease. Not peace, which implied stillness. Something closer to the feeling of having walked through the full distance of a thing and arrived on the other side of it standing. She was standing. The city was there. She turned from the window and she picked up the phone and she began the first call of the new order, because there was work to do and she was the person who did it, and the morning was already here whether she was ready for it